I hope that this post is able to shed some light on a situation that has been troubling my life for the past few months. My name is Grant. I am a lawyer in a small-town law firm out east, and in January I was contacted by a man who planned on suing a general practitioner for medical malpractice. This was not out of the ordinary, as my law firm deals almost exclusively with medical cases, and I find myself to be quite good at them. However, this particular client, whom I will remain unnamed for legal purposes, has caused me serious psychological stress, and I fear for my safety. During our first consultation over the phone, he informed me that he would be sending over his journal entries during the dates spanning his original accident, meeting with his care provider, and his eventual recovery. After reviewing the writings, I responded to the client that I would not be taking on his case, and that I thought it best he seek psychiatric and medical aid. Since declining to work with this client, I have received several harassing emails, threatening letters, and most alarmingly, packages containing clumps of human meat crudely wrapped in packaging tape. I have gone to the police. However, I am posting here to seek advice on how to proceed with the dilemma. I just want to feel safe again. Here are the journal entries. Entry 1. In the process of selling my home, I knew I needed to fix it up a bit. It is by no means a dump, but there are some items of general upkeep that I have put off over the years, and no one wants to buy a house with a leaky faucet. One of the items on my to-do list was to knock off the wasp mess that had been building up and clean out my rain gutters. I have always been fairly handy, but a bit on the lazy side as well. When my father died, he left me a large variety of tools that had been collecting rust in my garage. On a sunny Saturday, I took advantage of my day off from work and retrieved the ladder, gloves, and wasp spray from their resting places and ascended to the roof. There were several small nests that had gathered in the front, but the largest by far was set in the rear. After taking care of the little ones first, I stirred up enough courage to tackle the behemoth in the back. It was even bigger than I had imagined it to be from the ground. Wasps swarmed and hummed as I drew near. For a moment I hesitated. I am not one to shy away from bugs, but no one likes to be stung. After taking a moment to prepare myself, I pulled out the can of wasp spray and shot a stream of poisonous liquid at the hive. Immediately I realized that this nest was not like the others I had removed. Instead of killing the insects, my attack only seemed to anger them. I began to panic as several of the winged creatures flew straight past me and began circling back and around my body. One sting was all it took. Shock and fear took over my instincts, and I shuffled forward rapidly. Only a moment later, I found myself tumbling to the solid, unforgiving earth below. This is the incident that brought about my current injuries. I sustained a fracture in my left arm, a cracked rib, and a concussion. While these injuries were not enjoyable to endure, they were nothing compared to the other problems I faced. I had landed on my side, with my shoulder taking the initial hit. Miraculously, the x-rays revealed no broken bones on my right side, but a large black bruise wrapped around my shoulder, collarbone, and upper arm, making it almost unusable. After a few hours in the hospital, and a hefty bill attached, I was permitted to return home to recover. Like I said, the broken bones hurt, but there was something about my bruised right side that made even the smallest of tasks unbearable. I was prescribed a good amount of pain meds, but while they reduced the pain on my left side to virtually zero, the area of my body with the black bruise seemed wholly unaffected. It throbbed and ached like nothing I had experienced before. It is now Monday. I've contacted my boss and alerted him to my bodily state. I have received time off from work to recover. The black bruise has reduced in size, only covering my shoulder now, but the pain remains just as intense as the day I fell off the roof. Entry 2. It is now Tuesday. The bruise on my shoulder remains the biggest thorn in my side. I don't know how much more I can take of the pain. I went to the doctor this morning to complain about the pain medication I had received, but was only told that some injuries can be stubborn and to get some rest while I wait for the pain to slowly subside. But what the doctor didn't seem to understand is that the pain isn't subsiding. My other injuries have settled into a tolerable level of pain with the meds, but the shoulder bruise is all I think about. It is all that I could possibly think about. It demands to be felt every waking hour of the day. I can't fall asleep at night. I toss and turn, making sure to apply the least amount of pressure to my right side. It doesn't matter what position I'm in. The only thing on my mind is the dull ache of my right shoulder. Before I sat down to document today's events, I stood in front of the mirror with my shirt off, staring at the bruise. The color isn't purple, green, yellow, or any other color that you might expect a bruise to be. It's black as coal. As I write this, a new development is occurring. Along with the dull ache, there seems to be a sort of phantom itch below the skin. Scratching doesn't help, though that isn't stopping me from trying. The itch seems to be in the muscle itself, a burning kind of itch that, along with the ache, is threatening to drive me insane. As I sit here scratching my shoulder, the throbbing is intensifying, probably due to the disturbance of my hand rubbing furiously at the bruise, but the itch is beginning to outpace the pain, so I continue to scratch. I've taken off the sling my left arm was resting in. With the bodily sensations on my right side, I rarely even pause to notice the injuries on my left. I guess I should count that as a blessing. My bruise is so bad that my broken bones are hardly noticeable. Wouldn't any sane individual take a bad bruise over a fracture? Yet as I contemplate the trade-off, I would break any bone in my body to alleviate what I feel in my shoulder. That damn wasp nest and those damn wasps. If it wasn't for them, none of this would have happened. On top of it all, I am now behind schedule to get my house prepared for sale. Now that I think about it, I haven't even thought of selling my home since the accident. Before the fall, it was something that consumed my mind. They say moving is one of the most stressful events the average person may experience, right up there with the death of a loved one or divorce. I don't know if I fully believe that. I know from experience that both death and divorce can be pretty rough. But I'll admit selling my house was getting awfully close to rivaling those dreadful events. I'm not rich, and the market hasn't been in the best place lately. Yet despite these worries that have plagued me, the bruise has taken priority. Entry 3. I would consider today a turning point in my recovery. It is now Thursday, of the same week as the last entry, and I've finally decided to take my healing into my own hands. The doctors couldn't help me, or at the very least they wouldn't help me. Those bastards. I wonder if I have grounds for a lawsuit here. After all, what kind of doctor sends away a patient in as much pain as I have been in? I'll have to contact a lawyer and get this settled later. For now, all that is on my mind is recovery. Since the medication wasn't helping, and the burning itch continued to worsen my already grim situation, I did a little at-home surgery. Nothing major. I'm not crazy. I just took a pair of tweezers and pulled away some of the dead skin on the surface of the bruise. It was somewhat satisfying to peel away the top layer of the blackened dermis, but I was shocked to find that no matter how much skin I pulled away, the layer below looked just as black. I'll admit that I ended up cutting away a larger chunk than I had originally planned to, but I think that I've made some real progress. I successfully pulled away enough skin to get close enough to the source of the itch for a gratifying scratch. Of course, this did not take away the itch completely, but now when it gets really bad, I have a better avenue of digging my fingers in deep. I've scratched enough to leave my shoulder quite the bloody mess, but the relief I feel from scratching outweighs the additional damage my nails are causing the wound. I still haven't found a way to reduce the ache, but since today is the first time I've felt like I've made any kind of progress, I am deciding to call it a win. I may even get some sleep tonight if I can get past the incessant throb. I do think that I may have gotten a little carried away with the scratching. At one moment of serious desperation, I feverishly scraped at my skin, and without even realizing what I was doing, a finger slipped deeper into the wound than I had planned. With two knuckles submerged in my shoulder socket, I stared in horror at what I had done to myself. But right when pain and fear reached their peak, I realized that with my finger inside the meaty portion of my shoulder, I could really scratch at the source. I pulled my finger out before I did too much damage, and a spurt of blood exited the wound. I've covered it up in a sort of pseudo-dressing. I don't want to bandage myself up too much. I still need access when the itching gets really bad, but I'm limiting myself now after going too deep. I will only scratch if I feel it is truly an emergency. Entry 4. I found the solution to the shoulder pain. It is now Saturday. A full week has passed since my accident. I haven't left my house, other than the time I went to that charlatan of a doctor. I am supposed to pick up a refill on my prescription soon, but I won't need it since I haven't been taking the pills anyway. After the first time I picked away at my skin, I have found myself going back to the bathroom mirror on multiple occasions to peel away just a little more. That was until I accidentally pulled away something thicker and tougher than the bruised skin, a small strip of muscle. At first, the pain was excruciating, but a moment later, I realized that the dull ache had lessened some. At this news, I literally shouted for joy, jumping up and down like a child who has just been told they are being taken to an amusement park. I went back into my garage to get some better equipment. The tweezers were fine for skin, but now I was in need of pliers. I've never been more grateful for my meager inheritance of my father's tools than I was when I pulled the rusty metal clamp from my toolkit. I no longer felt hesitant about the damage I was doing to my shoulder. The pain needed to stop, so I sat up on my bathroom vanity, getting close to the mirror, and began pulling at the meat with the pliers. Some pieces broke off in small chunks, but a really successful pull meant I was revealing a strip of muscle as long as 3 inches. Have you ever had an ingrown hair and felt the satisfying relief of digging it out? It felt like that, although the pain was considerably more. With each rip and tear, I found myself feeling physically weaker, yet spiritually energized. The dull ache was finally gone. As I write this, I am completely free of pain. The gaping hole that was once my shoulder feels cool, liberated, and oddly euphoric. The whole area of my arm is tingling with delight. I honestly don't even remember what the pain felt like. The ecstasy is too powerful at this moment. I have the feeling that I am going to get a really good night's sleep, and I cannot wait to walk into that disgusting doctor's office that sent me packing with less than useless advice to wait and rest. I'm going to show them, all of them, the beauty and freedom I found in extraction. I was about to go to sleep when I noticed that my foot was feeling a bit tingly. I think I'll do one last surgery and call it a night. I met Rav during a big charades game in the STEM building's rec room. We were randomly paired up. Even though I got stuck on his interpretation of the phrase to be or not to be, we still managed to come in first place. I was doing the talking to the skull bit from Hamlet. He said, "The what?" "I thought you were deciding whether to throw out expired yogurt." We burst into laughter, and something about the raw timbre of his laugh drew me in. We talked about life, university, all the usual shit students talk about at loud parties. But as the conversation progressed, I really came to admire Raf's genuine passion about his major. The guy really loved mathematics. "It stips the spooky theoretical stuff that I like," he confessed, his eyes glinting under the fluorescent lights. "When math transcends reality, when its rules become pure art, too abstract to fit our mundane world." "Oh yeah, like what?" Well, like the Banach-Tarski paradox." He put his fingers on his temples in a funny, drunken way. "Basically, it's a theorem that says you can take any object, like say a big old beach ball, and you can tear it apart, rearrange the pieces in a slightly different way, and form 2 big old beach balls. No stretching, no shrinking, nothing extra added. It's like math bending reality. Wouldn't set you need extra material for the second beach ball." Revistit's grin widened. "That sips the beauty of it. The Banach-Tarski paradox works in a space where objects aren't sipped made of atoms, but of infinitely small points. And when you start dealing with infinity, all kinds of impossible-sounding things can happen." I pretended to understand, mesmerized by the glow in his eyes. Before he could launch into his next favorite paradox, I pulled him out of the party and led him down the hall. In my dorm, we shared a reckless makeout session that seemed to suspend time until the sound of my roommate's entrance shattered the moment. Rav fumbled for his shirt and began searching for his missing left shoe. Amid the commotion, he murmured, "I had such a great time tonight." I smiled. Me too. Even though he was a little awkwardly lanky, I thought he looked pretty cute, kind of like a tall runway model who keeps a pencil in his shirt pocket. Before he left my doorframe, his eyes locked onto mine. "So I still be blunt. Do you want to go out?" I blushed and shrugged. "Sure." "Great. How do you feel about a weird first date?" I was put off for a second. A weird first date? I know this is going to sound super nerdy and you can totally say no, but there's a big mathematics conference happening this Thursday. Apparently someone has a new proof of the Banach-Tarski paradox. The beach ball thing. Yeah. It used to be a very convoluted proof, like 25 pages. Yet some guy from Estonia has narrowed it down to like 3 lines. That sits kinda cool. It is. It's actually a pretty big deal in the math world. I know it may sound a little boring, but technically speaking, it sets a historic event. No joke, you would have serious cred among mathies if you came. So you're saying this could be my Woodstock? He laughed in a way that made him snort. I mean, it's more like math stock, but I genuinely think you will have a fun time. It was definitely weird, but why not have a quirky, memorable first date? Let's go to math stock. Because the whole math wing was under renovation, the conference wasn't happening at our university, so instead they had rented the event plaza at the City Center Mall. Oh, City Center Mall. A rundown, forgotten little dream of a mall that was constructed during the 1980s, back when it was really cool to add neon lights indoors and tacky marble fountains. Normally, I would only visit City Center to buy cheap stationery at the dollar store, but tonight, I'd attend an event hosting some of the world's greatest minds. Who would have thunk? Claudia, come in. Rav met me right at the side entrance, holding open the glass doors. All the boring preamble is over. The main event sits about to begin. I grabbed his hand and was led through the mall's eerie side entrance. Half of the lights were off, and all the stores were all closed behind rolled-down metal bars. The event plaza, on the other hand, was a brightly lit beehive. Dozens of gray-haired men were grabbing snacks from a buffet table. I could make out at least 100 or so plastic chairs facing a giant whiteboard on stage. Although it felt a little low budget, I could tell none of the mathematicians gave a shit. They were just happy to see each other and snack on some gyros. It felt like I was crashing their secret little party. On stage, the keynote speaker was already writing things on the board, symbols which made no sense to me, but slowly drew everyone else into seats. Ruth, X, FX have Nauer. X. Hello everyone, my name is Indrek, the speaker said. I come from a little college town in Estonia. Cheers and claps came enthusiastically, as if he was an opening act at a concert. I nodded dumbly, watching as the symbols multiplied like rabbits on the board. Indrek's accent thickened with each equation. His marker flew across the board as he layered functions, Gödel numbers and references to Pythagorean geometry, according to Rav. The atmosphere grew electric, as if we were witnessing a forbidden ritual. Ravet's eyes grew wide. Whoa, wait, no way. Hold on. Is he about to prove Gödel-Sipp's theorem? Is that what this is all leading to? Holy shit, this guy is about to prove the unprovable theorem. The what? I asked. A ginger-haired mathematician near the back smacked his forehead in disbelief. Indrek, you devil! This is incredible. The Estonian on stage gave a little smirk as he wrote the final equals sign. I think you will all be pleasantly surprised by the reveal. You could hear a pin drop in the plaza. No one said a word as Indrek wielded his dry erase marker. The finishing touch is, of course. In a single swift movement, Indrek drew a triangle at the bottom right of the board. Pikolzapar. Dalta. Something stabbed into the top of my head. It seriously felt as if a knife had sunk down the middle of my skull and shattered into 1,000 pieces. I swatted and gripped my scalp, grit my teeth. All around me came cries of agony. As soon as it came, the fiery knife retracted, replacing the sharp pain with a dull, throbbing ache, like there was an open wound in the center of my brain. A wave of groans came from the audience, as everyone staggered to protect their scalp. Rav massaged his own head, and then turned to me, looking terrified. What the hell was that? He asked. You felt that too? We both had nosebleeds. Reva took out a handkerchief, and let me wipe mine first. Good God. Indrek, the ginger prof exclaimed from the back. Who is that? Out from behind the Estonian speaker, there appeared another wiry-looking Estonian man in a brown suit, a duplicate copy of Indrek. The duplicate spoke with a satisfied smile. That Sipp's right. With the right dose of Banach-Tarski, I have replicated myself, for perhaps the 1,000th time. A chorus of gasps. All of the mathematicians swapped confused glances. Then Indrek Sipp's voice boomed, and my incredible equation has also invited an esteemed guest tonight, a name you still no doubt recognize from centuries ago. The audience stopped squirming. Everyone just looked stunned now. I promised our guest a meeting with all our brightest minds, all in one place. Indrek raised his hands, encircling everyone. You see, our guest lives for it. He feasts on it. Out from one of the mall's shadowy halls came a palanquin. That's Sipp's right, a palanquin, one of those ancient royal litters, except instead of being held by a procession of Roman slaves, it was several Indreks who held it. and atop the white marble seat was a tall, slumped skeleton of a man dressed in a traditional Greek toga, his thin lips stretched across his dry, sagging face. "My fellow scientists, mathematicians, and engineers," Indrek announced. "Allow me to introduce the one and only Pythagoras." Questions snaked through the crowd. Pythagoras. How? Why? What? As the palanquin marched forward, the ancient Greek mathematician lifted one of his thin fingers and pointed at the terrified ginger professor in the back. I could see the professor crumple on the spot. He screamed, gripped his head, and collapsed into a seizure. "Holy fuck! What is happening?" Pythagoras appeared to be smiling, as if he'd just absorbed fresh energy. Rab tugged at my wrist, and we both bolted at the same time back the way we came. As we left, I looked back to witness a wave of Indreks flow in from behind the palanquin. They raced and seized all the older, slower professors, like something out of Clash of the Titans or a zombie movie. About 60 or so people were left behind to fend off an army of Indreks. I never saw any of them again. In terms of survivors, there sits about 20. We're made up of TAs, students, and professors on the younger side. And despite our escape from the event plaza, the next couple hours brought nothing but despair. We ran and ran, but the mall did not reveal an exit. It's like the mall's geometry was being duplicated in random patterns over and over. We came across countless other plazas, escalators, and grocery stores, but mostly long, endless halls. We called 911, ecstatic that we still had a signal. But when the police finally entered the mall, they said they found nothing except empty chairs and a whiteboard. It's like Indrek had shifted us into a new dimension, some new alternate frequency. We even had scouts leave and explore branching halls here and there, only to come back with the same sorrowful expression on their face. It's just more mall. Nothing but more city center mall. For sleep, we broke into a Bed Bath & Beyond and stole a bunch of mattresses, pillows, and blankets. We had shifts of people guarding the entrance to make sure we weren't followed. For breakfast, we broke into a Taco Bell, where we learned that the electricity and gas connections all still worked. This gave a little hope because it meant there was an energy source somewhere, which meant there had to be an outside of the mall, which meant that there could still be some sort of escape. At least that's what some of the mathies seemed to think. Over the last day now, we've been exploring further and further east. We're constantly taking photos of any notable landmarks in case we need to backtrack. So far, we keep finding other plazas that contain marble fountains. There were winged cherubs spitting onto an elegantly carved Mobius strip. There was a fierce mermaid holding a perfect cube with water sprinkling around her. There even appeared to be one of a bald old man in a toga, pouring water into a bathtub. The mathematicians all thought it was supposed to be Archimedes, which I guess made sense because of his Eureka bathtub moments and whatnot, but it laid a new seed of worry. Was Archimedes also somewhere on a palanquin? Was he looking to suck our energy somehow? We made camp around the fountain because it provided ample drinking water, and because there was a pretzel shop nearby we could pillage for dinner. People were scared that we might never make it back home, and I couldn't blame them. I was scared too. As soon as someone stopped crying, someone else inevitably would start. Our spirits were low, very low to say the least. And so Rav, ever the optimist, took it upon himself to organize a game of charades. Everyone agreed to give it a shot. It would take our minds off the obvious and help with morale. Pairs were formed. The unspoken rule was to avoid mentioning any of our present situation, obviously. A Gen X professor did a pretty good impression of George Bush. A teacher SIPST assistant did an immaculate interpretation of killing two birds with one stone. When it was Rav's turn, he gave himself a serious expression and held a single object and looked at it from several angles, mouthing a pretend monologue. I savored the moment, remembering the fun we had had only a few days ago back in the STEM building's rec room. It felt like months ago at this point. "Hamlet," I said. "I believe the quote is that to be or not to be." "Sept." Rave turned to face me with a very sad smile. "Actually, Claudia," I stepped him, deciding whether to throw out expired yogurt. I smiled and acknowledged the past joke. He tried to smile back. I could see he was trying so hard, but the smile soon collapsed as he brought his palm to his face. Tears began to stream. Sobs soon followed. I said, "I'm so sorry I brought you here." This isn't set what math is supposed to be. This is fucking terrible. Awful. Claudia. I said I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. I cried too. So how's that baby brewing up? Harry asked while pouring everyone a glass of wine, except me. He said's been playing a lot of soccer in there. I shall tell you that, I answered, laughing and placing my hands on the belly. But hopefully he shall get out soon enough. Harry chuckled, and he and my husband got back to discussing whatever detail was left in the production's calendar. Tanya, Harry's wife, on the other hand, didn't laugh at all. Instead, she stared at me with a blank expression I couldn't quite decipher. They were the ones who had invited us over for dinner, to celebrate the deal my husband had signed with Harry's production company. Why is she acting like that? I wondered. But honestly, I wouldn't let her ruin what was one of the happiest moments of our lives. A few months ago, we had been living in a cramped studio downtown, with 2 unpaid rents, and now we were having dinner with this big shot producer for a movie my husband would be writing. Every day, I woke up thanking God we had this before the baby was born. I was 7 months pregnant. If putting up with this woman, looking at me like I was a zoo animal, was the price for all this, then I'd gladly pay it. But things got weird when I, feeling nauseous, excused myself to go to the bathroom, as I had many times that night. And as I was washing my hands to get back, I heard a knock on the door. I'm leaving, I called out to whoever was on the other side. When I opened it, it was Tanya. She stood there, glancing over her shoulder as if checking for anyone. You need to get out, she whispered like she was sharing a secret, or they still take your baby. Before I could even ask what, she turned around and walked back to the room where our husbands were. I sat back at the table, uneasy. What did she mean? Did I hear her correctly? Across from me, Tanya focused on the men's conversation, avoiding eye contact, pretending she hadn't just said what she did. Minutes passed in silence between me and her, while the men's discussion grew louder as they drank more. This is really a special moment, Harry said to my husband, in an emotional voice. I remember when Tanya was pregnant. She was the most beautiful. Harry then awkwardly placed his hand over hers, and she responded with a half smile. What happened? I blurted out, curious after the whole bathroom incident. They exchanged glances, and I saw my husband look away, uncomfortable. Harry opened his mouth to answer, but Tanya spoke first. I lost it, she said, locking eyes with me before shifting her gaze to her husband, but I guess it was worth it. Her face was a mix of cynicism and sadness. Harry quickly got up and asked her to help him set the dessert from the kitchen. She followed without protest. Something about all of this set off a strong alarm in my mind. And it got worse when I heard a heated whispering argument erupt between Tanya and Harry in the kitchen. And my husband's reaction was the worst. He sat right beside me, silent, and wore the most guilty, ashamed face I had ever seen in my life. That stops when the doorbell rang. Harry came sprinting out of the kitchen to open it. An old, grumpy-looking man stepped in, and I knew who he was because my husband had described him before. It was the movie's director. Harry and my husband treated him like a king, showering him with praise and filling his wine glass, but he remained stone-faced. The only moment of joy I witnessed was when he greeted me and noticed my belly, his lips stretched into a broad grin that sent chills down my spine. You never told me he was coming, I whispered to my husband. He and the crew were nearby and decided to drop by. It won't take long. But I really wanted to leave now, I continued, trying to be polite. I stepped not feeling well. I promise we still go right after dessert, he said with a drunken smile. Everyone talks about Tanya Sip's cheesecake. They say it Sip's incredible. We have to try it. Obviously, dessert was the last thing on my mind now. My anxiety grew as more and more people started coming through that door. The costume designer, the head of makeup, the VFX director, even a few of the actors, they all started showing up, one by one. They greeted each other, then turned to look at me, like I was the main star of some twisted movie playing out in this house. Then Tanya came back from the kitchen, carrying a tray of small plates for the crew. I could see in her face, she despised them. But mine was brought by Harry himself, who carried the plate carefully, like it was some precious treasure. As he placed it in front of me, I felt every eye in the room shift toward me, and an eerie silence settled. I looked at the cheesecake. It did look good, but I was certain now there was something more in it. I definitely shouldn't eat it. I'm a bit unwell right now, I said. Maybe I still eat it later. Honey, at least give it a bite, my husband said, while Harry still stood in front of us, waiting. As in just not that hungry. Said we take it home instead? The tension in the room was suffocating. My husband's demeanor shifted instantly, his expression darkening as he gripped my arm. Honey, don't be rude. His face a mix of menace and desperation. Eat the cake. These people are helping us. That answer was proof he knew very well about whatever was going on. I hesitated, staring at the plate for a few seconds, my mind racing, but before I could speak, Tanya placed a firm hand on my shoulder. Shep's just having a wave of nausea, she said, her voice calm. I sure remember how bad it felt. I said just take her to the bathroom 1 second to freshen up. Harry wasn't set happy, but he sighed and nodded. Fine, but be quick. Tanya helped me up, keeping her grip steady as we walked hand in hand toward the hallway. The moment we were out of sight, she pulled the car key from her pocket and pressed it into my palm. Take my car, she whispered. Its steps parked outside, second on the left. My heart pounded. What about you? They already took everything I had. Her eyes welled with tears. I still be fine, just go. Now. I followed her into the bathroom where she locked the door behind us and helped me jump through the window. I ran to the spot she pointed as fast as a 7 months pregnant woman could. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the key, but as soon as the engine roared to life, I floored it. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house shrinking in the distance, while my phone buzzed with calls from my husband. To preface this, I do not consider myself religious. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or anything supernatural. I have never used any recreational drugs, nor do I suffer from any medical conditions that would explain what I experienced last night. And yet, I cannot find a rational explanation for what happened. It started around 9:40 p.m. while I was driving home from work. The roads were nearly empty, just the occasional car passing by, headlights streaking through the dark. The night was clear. No storm, no wind, just the usual hum of distant traffic and the faint flicker of streetlights. I was maybe 3 minutes from home when I heard it. At first, I thought my car radio had turned on by itself. It was a high-pitched resonant tone, like a choir holding a single note, but unnatural. If you took the sound of wind howling through a canyon and somehow made it sing, you might get close to what I heard. It wasn't a horn, like the infamous sky trumpets people have recorded online. It was higher, thinner, and it carried an eerie, distant quality, as if it was coming from somewhere impossibly vast. The sound came from above, not from a building, not from a speaker, but from the sky itself. I slowed my car down, pulled over to the side, and rolled my window down. The air was still. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just that sound, stretching on and on for what felt like forever, though in reality, it must have been around 5 minutes. A deep sense of unease settled in my stomach. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just noise. It felt intentional. I grabbed my phone and started recording. I didn't know what else to do. As I listened, I noticed something even more unsettling. The sound wasn't fading in and out like a natural noise would. It was constant, unwavering, like a single unbroken note being played by something vast and unseen. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was too silent. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like the world had been momentarily muted. No cars in the distance, no insects, no wind. Then, just as I thought it was over, it was followed by a sharp, high-pitched static. Not regular static. It was piercing, shrill, like an old radio struggling to tune into a station that shouldn't exist. It only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I checked my recording afterward, and sure enough, the sound was there, until the last few seconds, where it was cut off by that same high-pitched static. I tried to upload it online, but for some reason my phone refused to process the file. Every attempt resulted in an error message, as if something didn't want it to be shared. I don't know what I heard last night. I've scoured forums, Listen to every sky trumpet recording I could find, but nothing matches. If anyone out there has heard something similar, please let me know, because I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whatever it was, it heard me too. My small vessel careens the choppy waters. I wipe the sweat from my brow. The weather is sweltering, despite the cloud covering above us. My mission calls, as it did for my father before me, and his grandfather before him. I'm unsure if it's the sea itself which calls or something within its depths, but I know I must answer. James says, jotting the words down on paper. I tend to ignore his odd ramblings, because, well, he pays me a lot to man this boat, but I start to wonder if it's really all worth it. Our boat glides over aquamarine waves. Large dark rocks jut out of the water like teeth. It's becoming tough to avoid them. I don't like the looks of this. It's getting pretty dangerous out here, I say. You're not getting a damn cent if you don't keep fucking going. He screams, a vein popping out of his forehead. I waver in anger but ultimately continue on. Appearing out of nowhere. Cool blasts of fog. We become suffocated inside it. Panic ensues in my mind. I scream, hardly able to see anything. Calm down. Just follow my lead. James says. We are almost at the coordinates. The coordinates my own father sacrificed his life to get. The fog dissipates quicker than it arrived. I turn towards James, who watches in eager anticipation as we inch closer to the destination. We're here. One can only traverse this forbidden area every 60 years. Other times it ceases to exist. He looks overjoyed. Soon I'll have accomplished what my ancestors tried for millennia. What the fuck is that? I say. In the now motionless waters before me, float a couple dozen severed arms. Fresh removals, I assume due to the blood filling the water. I dare not ask where they're from. I lean over the side of the boat and hurl. My mind and legs feel like jello. What has he gotten me into? In my nervous contemplation, I feel a hand touch my back. I turn around to see James. He shoves me into the eerie waters. You have served your purpose, he says, giddy with excitement. I am closer now than my forefathers ever were. Frantic, I paddle back trying to reach the boat. All the while James looks on in eager anticipation. The severed limbs twitch before pointing in my direction. They thrash towards me, splashing blood all about the beautiful blue water. James, let me back on board. I scream, but it's to no avail. Before I know it, the limbs drag me under. I begin my slow descent towards the murky depths beneath the sun's warmth. The last thing I hear before going under is James speaking. My father would be proud, he says. As I sink, holding my breath, I notice something above me. A strange blue symbol now glows in the sea, just above where I was dragged under. I recall James's rambling of an ancient language, one lost to time. To the normal human eye, it would be unreadable. I can understand it. My whole bloodline can. That's why I'm here, he said the day prior. I watch as the boat continues its course without me. I sank for what felt like an eternity, the arms keeping a ghoulish grip on my body. It's strange. Despite being dragged further below, I don't feel any different. The pressure bears no effect on me. And the weirdest part, I can breathe underwater. Is it that strange light above the surface? Even though I'm far below where the light of the sun reaches, that strange blue light remains visible, hundreds of feet above me. That's the last thing I remembered. When I woke up, I'm in a dark, damp cave. I fumble around on the cave floor, eventually brushing my hand on something made of leather, a book. Just enough light from the morning sun glistens in off the water to render it visible. It has hundreds of pages, all of James' ramblings collected into one book of madness. I skim through it before reading the last page. I know where my next destination lies. Commandeering the ship, I head west. I no longer have any need for maps or navigational tools. The sigil told me everything I need to know. Though the distance traveled is vast, it appears to take no time at all. Before I know it, my boat comes closer to the cave's entrance. Large stalagmites peek out of the waves at the mouth of the cave, beckoning one inside. The interior is unseeable from the outside. I stop my boat right outside this esoteric entrance, not bothering to anchor it or tie it down. Soon I won't need it after all. Stepping out of the boat, I begin my swim into the mouth of the watery cave. It chills me to my bone, but I don't mind, only focused on going forth. As I prepare to traverse the murky waters, I spot a fleeting glimpse of lone limbs struggling to swim alongside me. A sense of familiarity washes over me. On one limb, a shiny object around the wrist catches my eye. My dad's old watch. Soon I join him in the deep. I can view his presence even from the mouth of the cave. It glows the same way that forgotten sigil had, beckoning me forth. He'll soon be before me, glowing a strange bluish-green hue, his arms outstretched, waiting to embrace me, wearing a skeletal grin. Soon I could finally join him on his ship, in the depths. Theron thrust the freshly chopped logs into the waiting hearth. With a single strike of the flint and steel, the flame roared to life. His shivers receded, as the satisfying warmth of the fire warmed the cabin around him. This fire will last us till dusk. Theron thought relieved no more fuel would be needed for the night. The walls creaked from the storm outside. They'd been through far worse, and would hold strong as they had Theron's whole life. "Thank you, son," Theron Sit's mother said in a low, appreciative tone. "Where your father here we set, no need for this meager flame." Theron Sit's face hardened at the mention of his father. Without turning to his mother, he said, "You Sips heard from him?" "Yes," she said dolefully. "He won't set be returning until after Mahura." 2 months, Theron thought, unsurprised, but frustrated nonetheless. Of course, the great General Talion Miles, blessed of Ra, couldn't bear even a single day of winter with his family. "Some good his warmth does us now," Theron said. "He would be here were it not for the Realmers and their winter-raged sun," Mother said in Father Sep's defense as always, but with ever-decreasing energy. "What he does is for our country, to protect our home, to protect you and I." Theron kneeled before the flame, looking up at his mother. She was swaddled in numerous furs that concealed her thin frame, pale skin, dark hair, with barely visible jowls of age marking her otherwise porcelain-like face. They stared at one another for a moment, each of their gazes attempting to convince the other. With a sigh, Theron stood. "I'm going for a hunt. Need to get my mind off all this talk of father. A fat rabbit might do my empty gullet some good as well," Theron thought. "At a time like this?" Mother asked. "Are you sure we could manage with the dried foods for tonight until the storm passes?" Theron nodded, donning his furs and pulling back his long greasy hair underneath his hat. It was cold outside even for Theron, but he'd hunted in worse conditions during his training to be a ranger. Part of him still wanted the life of a ranger, but his mother was counting on him in the absence of his father. It wasn't long ago that father left for 3 consecutive years, not even sending letters he wrote, rather frostbitten couriers up the mountainside to deliver his words. Now it had been 2 summers since they last saw him. Theron had turned 17 in that time, all the while having not spoken to a soul besides his mother. "If you really must go, take your shirt," Mother said, rocking in her chair without turning to Theron. "No point arguing. Another layer won't hurt anyhow." Reaching into the same closet from which he pulled his furs, Theron retrieved an elegant chain shirt, just large enough to cover his entire torso and part of his shoulders. It gleamed a gentle blue even in the slightest light. It was made from mithril, forged in ord, one of the only gifts father ever gave Theron. It was cool to the touch, and he slipped it just above the tunic, acting as his base layer. "Nothing's ever even come close to attacking me up there, but if it puts Mother's mind at ease, I can't complain." The loneliness of the mountainside cabin was driving him mad, but Theron found some small solace in hunting. The company of trees and beasts still beat his mother on days like this one. He grabbed his crossbow, hatchet, rope, and knife last. Above all his equipment, the knife held the greatest sentimental value, being a gift from his trainer. It was black and reflective, allegedly forged from the sky metals of the surrounding mountains. "First, I'll check the traps, and if the storm dies down, I'll hike up to the tree stand. If the storm doesn't die down, well, dried foods it is." Theron walked through their elaborately decorated living room. Rovachilian military livery, medals, and a singular painting of the Battle of Conifer lined the walls. The painting depicted the Rovachelian military standing staunchly organized, shielded by coniferous trees near the walled city of Hurin, led by Theron's father Talion, battling against an endless horde of Orcaer and human realmers. The Rovachelians were in lines of crossbows and polearms, with the realmers being portrayed as disorganized savages. Theron always hated the painting, knowing even his father detested the depiction of his most honored foes. Moving to the door, Theron could hear the full roar of the storm on the other side, and for just a moment reconsidered heading out to hunt. He turned back to see his mother gently lost in the warmth of the hearth, dozing off. Despite her blind devotion to his father, Theron still loved his mother. She was kind, and taught him nearly all he knew of the world, save for what the Seterandi showed him a few years ago. She'll be fine. Probably just sleep through the storm, and I'll be back by the time she wakes up. With that, Theron thrust open the door. Snow immediately spilled out onto the cabin floor from the porch. A billowing wind nearly toppled Theron over. He pushed through the door quickly and closed it behind him. The forest stood undaunted by the storm's fury before him. Traps shouldn't be buried yet, even in these conditions. Glad I'm leaving now rather than later, Theron thought hopefully. Trudging through the snow, Theron was scanning the snowy landscape for any of his traps that may have been tripped. In all, he had 3 traps set for this time of winter, all of which were snare traps he learned to make during his ranger training. He'd set more, but maintaining them by himself amidst inclement weather wasn't easy. Besides, they weren't terribly successful this time of year anyway. However, they were just successful enough to keep Theron coming back. It was a quarter-hour hike to his first trap, with the others laying further away, the last of which rested just a couple 100 feet from his tree stand. As expected, the first snare was empty. It was a simple trap, but effective. A small stake plunged into the ground with a noose coiled around to snare any unbeknownst rabbit or other diminutive creature. Years ago, Theron caught a beautiful fox, just the right size for the trap. It was Bress who convinced him to let it go. She always had a way of making him act softer than he would otherwise. Theron couldn't help but lose himself thinking about Bree while he walked to the next trap. She was a Seterandi, a variety of Ceravarian, or deerfolk, as the Rovachelians would call them. They resembled reindeer, though they stood on 2 hooved legs, walked, talked, and behaved much as the other humanoids of Adrang. Bree's people were natives to the Mesh region where Theron's cabin resided, nomadic, peaceful, and adept rangers. The Seterandi took Theron under their wing after seeing his struggles in the surrounding forests. Bree was his trainer, herself being a young ranger, tasked with teaching Theron as one of her final tests. Though she was mostly vegetarian, she was an adept trapper, mostly for the purpose of dissuading assailants to the Seterandi's land. Practically everything Theron knew of the Mesh forests he learned from Bray, and in the midst of his training forged a prosperous relationship with the Seterandi. That was until Father found out. The storm began to calm, just as Theron reached the second trap. It was empty, but with the storm quieting, Theron was excited to hike up to his tree stand. It was unlikely he'd catch a deer, or any prey for that matter, but the view from the stand was worth it, whether he went hungry or not. He'd built the stand with Bree's help, his talent for woodworking pairing perfectly with her geographical knowledge. The last stretch of the hike was steep, but with the storm having died down, it was rather pleasant. A gentle snowfall accompanied Theron on his hike upwards, crepuscular rays breaking through the gaps in the clouds, his rhythmic, muffled footsteps calming Theron's rampant thoughts. Breaking through the silence was a shrill, bestial cry unlike any Theron had ever heard before. The cry echoed through the trees and off the mountainside before at last being absorbed by the snow. Theron paused, a pit opening in his stomach. The screech was vaguely bird-like, but not like any bird of the Mesh region, and he'd learned them all. Damn this, I'm a ranger. I know the beasts of this mountain, and none of 'em stand a chance, Theron thought, clutching and loading his crossbow. Theron kept his crossbow ready, and his eyes to the trees whilst he walked to the last trap. On any other day, it would have been a rather mundane discovery, but today it disturbed him. The trap was tripped, a fresh bloodstain marking the ground, but no prey anywhere in sight. The stake where the trap lay was mangled, the noose torn. It was perfectly possible a predator came along and ate the captive creature, but foxes, wolves, minks, even bears would usually leave something behind, or cache something nearby. The bloodstain was large too, meaning the meal was eaten here, so it probably wasn't an eagle, hawk, owl, or some other raptor. Most bizarre of all, the tracks surrounding the trap were that of a rabbit as expected, and more strangely reindeer, with the reindeer tracks vanishing around the trap. What in the world happened here? Theron thought, his resolve waning slightly. Theron scanned the landscape, seeing his tree stand just above. The forest was silent again. Whatever it was, it's probably close by still. Could track me back down the mountain as well. Better I sit in my stand, so at least it has to play my game. Theron thought, his confidence returning slightly. He walked to the ladder and looked up at his stand. It was a small square shack built into the side of the tree with a small slit to look down on the ground below and loose arrows from above on unsuspecting prey. Per Bray's suggestion, the stand had a trapdoor and a slit to cover the window for privacy. The space inside was just large enough for two. Climbing into the stand, Theron sat looking out the slit to see nearly the entire mountainside beneath him. He could even see the smoke from the cabin chimney rise above their home, though not the cabin itself. It was a wise choice to wait inside the deer stand. As the wind started to pick up once more, the storm was returning, and there wasn't more than a few more hours of sunlight. Theron was more on guard than usual, eyes darting back and forth across the forest floor. He was shielded in the shack. So were the beasts to know he was here. He'd have the advantage, but he was still unnerved by the whole experience. He started to lose track of time, as the only sound coming from outside the stand was the growing storm. He relaxed, feeling a sense of normalcy return to this hunt. As usual, it seemed as though no beast would be wandering in front of his stand. At last Theron thought he could relax, letting the wind and snow swirl around his stand. He leaned back, staring at the empty seat beside him. Besides his youthful, patchy-bearded face, Theron was warm, and this problem was easily remedied as he dipped his head into his coat and dragged down his hat. One final glance at the empty seat, and a pang of hunger, Theron fell asleep. "You still with me, Ther?" a soft, familiar voice said, snapping its fingers in front of his face. It was Bree, his teacher, and the only friend Theron ever knew trapped on this desolate mountain. "Hello?" she said, in a rising tone, poking him. They were nearly the same height. Bree with tawny fur, a black nose, ears to match that of a reindeer, and two giant black eyes on a bed of hazel. Most striking of all were her antlers, still short compared to the other Citarandi, but unmistakable. Rather than a sophisticated crossbow like the one Theron used, she carried a short bow around her back with a knife strapped to the loincloth around her waist. White paint marked much of her torso, reading in Silva Nagach, or Scouts in the common tongue. It was strange being face to face with her again, like she never left. Yes, I'm with you now, quit it once-ya," Theron replied, swatting away her hand. "All right then, prove it," Bryce said, giggling before putting on Theron Sip's annoyed tone. "Wantcha?" They were squatting in front of the mangled remains of one of their trampled snare traps. This one Brave had set before, as an example for Theron. In moments as he Sip'd done it countless times now, Theron strung the trap back together. He looked at Bray with a satisfied grin. "Good, eh? For a novice, not half bad," she teased. "Still a long way before you stebber an adept ranger like myself." Suddenly a shadow cast over the pair, a dark looming figure behind Bree. Theron looked up to see the unforgettable glare of his father, his face not much more than a shadow cast by the blazing sun behind him. He was furious, and his steel-plated hands tore Bree from where she stood. The world stretched out as Theron tried to reach her, but she was suddenly so far away again. "No son of Rovachel will mingle with the likes of beasts," Talion announced, echoing from somewhere down the mountain. "To the city with these ingrates, this land is theirs no longer." Crying out at his father, Theron could just make out Breasted's voice as though she were still close despite being so far away. "Theron, help us. Look down. I'm still here. Help me. Theron, wake up." Theron was thrust awake with a violent shake of the stand. Thunder from white lightning roared outside, trembling the entire tree, and Theron down to his bones. The storm had reached its pinnacle, and the tree stand was barely holding up. "It's dark outside. How long was I out? I have to get home to Mother quickly." With that, Theron launched himself through the trapdoor down to the forest floor once more. The bottom rungs of the ladders implanted into the tree were reduced to splinters, like something large and heavy had tried to climb them, failed, and in a blind fury tore them apart. Theron had to leap from nearly 6 feet to skip the eviscerated rungs. He had no time to think about what destroyed them, as the storm battered at him furiously. The wind sliced through his furs as though he wore nothing, and nearly toppled him at the same time, snow forming into pits around his ankles in mere seconds when he stood still. He was nearly blind amidst the storm, but could see just well enough to tell he was heading in the right direction. All I have to do is follow the mountain downwards. I need no path. As long as I'm descending, I couldn't miss the cabin if I tried. Theron thought, reassuring himself. What would have been a pleasant hour-long descent soon became a feat of physical endurance, unlike any Theron had faced before. If he fell into the snow, it would take practically no time at all for him to be buried, so balance was key, all while shivering violently from the cutting cold. Damn it, he thought with a sudden realization. I left my crossbow at the stand. Perhaps it was for the best, as even a slight change in his weight might have thrust him into that white abyss. As Theron descended and neared the flat ground which the cabin rested on, he heard the shrill cry from before. Then he heard it again, and again. He was swallowed in a cacophony of high-pitched screeching. It was nearly deafening, but he could feel he was close to the cabin. Just a little further, he thought with a sudden tremble in his stomach, so hungry. At last, after trudging for perhaps 2 hours, Theron reached the porch of the cabin, which, despite being elevated, was utterly consumed by the ravenous snow. In horror, he realized the fire inside had burned out. And worse, the front entrance was wide open, the door seemingly torn from its hinges and its wooden remains cast away amidst the storm. Mother, he thought in alarm. Theron rushed inside, crying out, "Mother, are you there?" His cries were drowned out by the only response, crunching and squelching from something within. It was pitch black in the building, but Theron wasn't alone. "Mother, is that you?" he sputtered out, fumbling for the lantern that rested on the hassock just beside the entrance. Bringing the flame to life, Theron was paralyzed with what he saw. A wretched amalgam of fur, feathers, beak, and talons was sprawled over his dead mother, her face petrified in horror as the creature feasted on her entrails. It was somewhat human in shape, with tawny brown furred legs and strange talons that looked as though they burst from hooves. Its wings seemed only partially complete as they transformed into human-like arms at the elbow. Most striking of all was the head of the creature, like a vulture with reddish and pink folds leading into a curved beak stained red. Something was familiar about its eyes, but Theron had no time to think. The creature noticed the light and leapt from his mother towards Theron, fumbling on the furniture between the two, letting out that alien screech all the while. Theron, with a spike of adrenaline, dashed back into the storm outside, fear overwhelming any thought of grief or defending his home. The beast screeched behind him, joining in the maddening chorus of the storm. Bolts of lightning illuminated the surrounding forest, just brief enough for Theron to see wicked reflections amidst the trees. Eyes, all around me, there's so many of them. Theron was near utter exhaustion, but sprinted through the snow, dangling on some small glimmer of hope. He didn't make it far before being tackled, a sharp pain ringing through his left leg. Falling into the snow, Theron turned upright just for the screeching creature to mount him above his waist, using one talon to pin him by his chest, and the other to scratch ruthlessly at his stomach. The furs were helpless against the razor-like sharpness of the creature's talons, but after a few violent scrapes, the talons caught on his mithril shirt beneath. Seizing the moment, Theron reached for the hatchet on his belt. Just as he unbuckled the weapon, the creature pinned his arm with its free talon, and its beak rammed deep into his shoulder, past where the shirt protected him. Screaming in pain, Theron's vision began to blur. It was no shallow wound, with his arm falling limp and useless. The creature fought with intelligence, shifting its weight to match that of Theron's, making it near impossible for him to gain an advantage. Desperate, Theron reached for his last weapon, the hunting knife, pulling free with ease. He stabbed wildly, slashing feathers and fur alike, before finally plunging the knife deep somewhere in its stomach, a sizzling sound and sinewy smoke emanating from the wound. The creature screeched once more, reeling from the blow. This is my only chance, Theron thought, as he pushed with all his might from his legs up to his hips, driving the creature over his head and rolling into the snow. The cacophony of cries suddenly stifled, as Theron rose to his knees, just above the creature, staring terrified back at him. Its breathing was haggard, the screeching transformed into weak, garbled squeaks. It desperately flapped its incomplete wings, trying to escape. Another strike of white lightning showed dozens of horrible spectators to still be watching. His right shoulder mangled, Theron mounted the creature above its own humanoid waist, before driving his knife at last into its chest. The blow was true, piercing just where its heart lay, and with one final gasp the creature fell still. Its eyes lay wide and blank, ever familiar and burned into Theron's mind. Theron glanced around the trees. As the storm rapidly settled, the thunder ceased, and the howling wind quieted. He could still hear the beasts out in the dark, shuffling away from him, their cries silent at last. Standing, he limped back to the cabin, leaving the corpse of the creature to be buried in the snow. Reaching the entrance, Theron collapsed, scanning his mother. Her body lay a sundered mess, gore and viscera scattered about the living room. She was half-eaten, and nearly unrecognizable save for her face, which lay frozen as before. Grief finally fell upon him, replacing the pain of his wounds and the cold with something more internal. He cried, wailing into the dark. It took mere moments before Theron's sadness was overwhelmed with an ancient sensation: hunger. Glancing back into the dark, a break in the clouds revealed the moon's serenity, its blue light washing over Theron. The moon was full and glorious, crashing upon his mind with the unstoppable force of an avalanche. Euphoria and pain stirred within Theron, and across his entire body, feathers rapidly manifesting across his entire body. His feet trembled and snapped, reshaping into talons that pierced through his boots. His hands and arms burst outwards, spreading into a thin membrane that was soon covered in feathers. The euphoria and pain subsided, and all that remained was that primal feeling. At last Theron turned to his mother for a feast. Our school was old. There were two buildings, the main one where we had most of our classes and a smaller one for science subjects. Most students stayed in the main building. The science building had an eerie atmosphere, high ceilings, cold hallways, and a strange stale smell, like time had stopped inside. Rumors had been going around for years. The seniors told us that beneath the science building, there was a hidden floor, a punishment room, they said. A place where students were taken if they were too undisciplined. Of course, we thought they were just trying to scare us. But then we made a mistake. It was a normal school day, and there were 5 of us when we sneaked into the science building during lunch. Nobody ever went downstairs. People said there was nothing there except a heating room, but we wanted to see for ourselves. The staircase led down into a long, cold corridor. The lights flickered, and the air smelled of old concrete and dust. At the end of the hall there were 3 doors. They weren't like normal doors. They were heavy metal with thick handles, almost like bunker doors. We assumed they were locked, but when Alex pulled on one, it swung open without a sound. Behind it was a dark passageway. "I still go first," Alex said. Before we could stop him, he stepped inside. 3 or 4 minutes passed before he came back. His face was pale. "It steps like a maze in there," he whispered. I wasn't sure if he was exaggerating or not, but I had to see it for myself, so I stepped in. The air was stale, the floor rough beneath my feet. I walked straight ahead, passing hallways that branched off to the left and right. Everything looked the same. Bare walls, no windows, no doors. Then I heard it for the first time. A metallic scraping sound, distant and muffled. I froze, listening. Then a dull thud echoed through the darkness. My heartbeat quickened, but I forced myself to keep moving. Suddenly the hallway opened into a room. It was instead a heating room. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust. In the middle stood an old wooden table with rusty handcuffs on top. Behind it, a cabinet sat slightly open. I didn't want to know what was inside. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not mine. I held my breath. Maybe it was Alex, maybe one of the others, but it didn't sound like them. Slow, intentional. I stepped backward, my eyes locked on the dark room ahead. No one was there, but I knew I wasn't stet alone. Then my phone vibrated. "Come out now. A teacher is here. You are not supposed to be down there." I ran. When I reached the top of the stairs, the principal was waiting. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something unsettling. "If I catch you down there again, you'll be expelled," he said. His voice was quiet. 2 weeks later, the staircase leading downstairs was sealed off. Nobody talked about it. Then a few days after that, the school announced that we were merging with another. Our building was scheduled to be demolished. And then the principal resigned. He had been at the school since the beginning. Some of the teachers said he had been there when it first opened. I asked one of them if it was true. He only nodded. He wasn't just there, he said, lowering his voice. He helped design the building. A chill ran through me. I thought about the rooms down there, the hallways, the table with the handcuffs. Maybe this wasn't set a coincidence. Maybe the principal knew we had gotten too close. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want anyone finding out why those rooms had really been built. Grief is a slow poison. It seeps into the bones, into the marrow, and hollows you out from the inside. It had eaten away at me for years, stripping me down until all that remained was the desperate wish to rewrite my own story. And then I found the way. It began with late nights, scribbled calculations in the dim glow of my basement lamp, my fingers stained with ink, my breath shallow with anticipation. The machine was not elegant. It was a thing of wires and rust, a grotesque amalgamation of scavenged parts, old radios, gutted televisions, copper tubing twisted like veins of some mechanical beast. The core was the heart of it all, a pulsating, humming mass of stolen technology and my own crude attempts at innovation. It was ugly, but it was mine. At first, I told myself it was about science. I was proving something to the world, to myself. But deep down, I knew better. It was about them. My wife, my daughter, the ones I lost in a moment of senseless tragedy, a car swerving where it shouldn't have. A brief lapse of attention, the universe swallowing them whole and leaving me behind to rot in the silence of our home. The first test was simple. Go back one day, move an object, see if anything changed. I placed a watch on the opposite side of the table. When I returned, my past self was staring at it, confused, running a hand through his hair. Proof. It works. Then came the next step. I traveled further, days at a time, weeks. I tested cause and effect, like a child prodding at an anthill, watching the tiny lives scramble. I spoke to myself, whispered warnings, nudged fate in one direction or another. And every time I returned, reality was subtly different. A book misplaced, a conversation remembered differently, a headline that didn't match my memory. I should have stopped. "Why do you spend so much time in the basement?" my brother Michael asked one evening. He had started dropping by more often, a silent guardian against my growing isolation. I slipped him working on something important. He sighed, rubbing his hands together, as if weighing his next words. "You Steph been different since they died." I get it. I do. But this isn't Steph's healthy. I didn't answer. I couldn't tell him. He wouldn't understand. He had a wife, kids, a life that didn't revolve around a grief that gnawed at the edges of his soul. If only I could fix it. The day I finally did it, the day I stood on the sidewalk and saw her again, was the happiest of my life. There she was, my wife, holding our daughter's tiny hand, her laughter a melody I thought I had lost forever. I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. This was it. This was my moment. I stepped forward. Reality cracked. The world shuddered. The air around me turned thick, viscous. My vision doubled, tripled. My hands were not my own, too many fingers, too few. My wife turned to me, but her face was wrong. Her eyes were dark pools, reflections of something vast and unknowable. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I ran. I fled back to my machine, back to the basement, back to the safety of knowing I had control. But I didn't stop. I told myself I could fix it. I had simply gone too far. I needed to refine my method. I needed to try again. The addiction set in quietly, like ivy creeping up an old house. One more trip, I told myself. One more adjustment. I could make things perfect. I could make them stay. But time had other plans. I started to lose myself. The jumps blurred together. My hands looked wrong in the mirror. Elongated, too many knuckles. My memories became fractured. Had I spoken to Michael yesterday or last week? Had I eaten today? Did I even exist in this moment? Or had I left pieces of myself scattered through time? And then one day I looked in the mirror and did not recognize the thing staring back at me. The machine groaned, its wires fraying like the unraveling edges of my mind. I no longer used notebooks. I simply knew where I was going, or at least, I thought I did. I had to escape. Forward. I would go forward. I would travel until I found a point where I could reset it all, where I could undo every mistake, every ripple, every tear in the fabric of time that I had caused. I stepped into the machine one final time. The universe decayed around me. The stars died, one by one, until I floated in a sea of cold nothingness. My body dissolved and slowly emerged back from the lost dust that came from the stars. Time collapsed, pulled inward, folding over itself like the closing of a book. And then, light. The birth of everything. I watched as galaxies formed, as the first sparks of life flickered into existence. I drifted through eons, nameless, faceless, waiting for the moment I had aimed for, the moment where I could step in and finally make things right. But something was wrong. I reached my home, my past, my life. I saw them, my wife, my daughter, Michael. He was there, in my house, drinking with my wife and hugging a little boy. Who was that boy? I wanted to reach out, tap the window, and talk to my family, but they did not recognize me. I was a but shadow, a whisper, a human being outside of time. I had become something else, something forgotten. I wanted to scream, but there was no voice left in me. I wanted to cry, but tears were not forming. I wanted to explain everything, but then I understood. I had never truly left. I had always been here, watching, reaching, failing, a ghost of my own making, a prisoner of my own obsession. I didn't exist. Maybe I never had. And yet I'm here being the appendage that the universe has not removed yet. The miscalculation on a perfect equation that is reality. The aborted element from time. I am nothing. For me, this whole experience took approximately a few days, maybe even weeks. I witnessed the horror of the downfall of societies, the destruction of stars, and the rebirth from nothing of the universe. I forgot my wife and daughter's names. My brother's name is the only I remember now. I don't really know why. I used to think that traveling across time would be what would save me from the unending horror that is losing everyone you once loved. It is now, as I write this, trying to live in a strange world that looks almost exactly as the one I left eons ago, that I finally understand that time is not the solution to horror. Time is the horror. When I was a kid, I wanted nothing more than whatever the newest, most popular toy was at the time. Action figures, playhouses, stuffed animals. As long as it had a cool commercial, I wanted it. My parents even had a running joke about it, that they didn't need to ask me for Christmas or birthday lists. They'd just have to turn the TV on and see what toy commercials came on. And in winter of 2009, when I was 5 years old, the new hit toy of the Christmas season was Bugsy. Bugsy was not, as the name suggested, a bug. No, he was a stuffed animal. I can't really tell you what he looked like. He was a weird little fantasy creature, like if you fused every cutesy woodland animal you could think of together into one easily marketable toy. Big snout, fluffy tail, cute little fangs that were stitched into the fabric. But Bugsy wasn't just any toy. No, Bugsy could move. This wasn't too impressive on its own. Toys could move around on their own for a while now. Things like Furbies could open their mouths and blink and tell you to feed them. The commercials showed Bugsy walking and jumping and waving hello though, so I was enthralled. Who knew a toy could do all that? Looking back, my parents probably thought it was bullshit, but I wanted him, and he wasn't too expensive, so I was pleased to open one of my presents on Christmas morning that year, only to find myself face to face with the adorable little gremlin himself. I was overjoyed. I opened the box as fast as I could, even before I looked at the rest of my gifts. The box said that the batteries were included, thankfully. So I immediately flipped the switch on the back of his left foot and watched Bugsy come to life. At first, he didn't do anything. I flipped the switch on and off a few more times, thinking that it would help somehow. Eventually, I decided to leave it in the on position, while I set it aside and opened my other gifts. Once I had opened the others, I was about ready to give up on Bugsy. Just then, though, my mom pointed at it. Look, look, it sits moving. I whipped my head around to see Bugsy sitting up against the table leg where I'd set him down. His left arm was pointing right at me. He started doing other things once I started playing with him. He didn't get up and dance around like in the commercials, but he waved and kicked his little feet and nodded his head to the beat of some inaudible song. I loved it. I loved my other gifts too, of course, but Bugsy was something else. Before I took all my toys up to my room so I could play with them, my mom showed me the little instruction booklet that came with Bugsy. It was all the standard stuff. Turn off when not in use. Don't machine wash. All that, she specifically pointed out that I couldn't keep Bugsy too warm. The booklet said that it could mess with his movement. I like to sleep with my stuffed animals in bed, so this was important. I didn't want to break Bugsy. I spent the whole rest of the day in my room playing with my new toys. I had robot battles, lined up all my toy soldiers, and most importantly, played with Bugsy. I had figured out the key to his movement fairly quickly. Whenever I put my hand up to him, he would move. If it was close to his head would bonk up against it. If it was close to his arm, he'd point. If I moved it up and down, he'd bob his head. This new information made playing a whole lot easier. I could make Bugsy do all these little movements on command. He could even salute all the little soldiers. I played into the night. It was one of the best Christmases I'd ever had. By the end of the day, I had all my toys lined up nice and neat on my soft and cozy carpet. I slept like a baby that night. Bugsy became a fast favorite of mine over the next few weeks. I showed him to all of my friends and family. I brought him to school for show and tell once, and another kid said she had one too. I ended up making a friend because of Bugsy. We still talk all these years later. As the months went by, though, Bugsy started acting strange. Sometimes I'd find him in different places around my room than where I'd left him. He'd be at one corner of my bed when I left for school, and when I got back home, he'd be in the center. He'd be on the top shelf of my closet when I went to bed, and when I woke up, he'd be face down on the floor. One time I thought I'd lost him, but soon found that he'd made his way under my bed. I asked my parents if they'd been moving Bugsy while I wasn't looking, but they denied it. I didn't believe them at first, but one night I remember being awoken to a thud from the far corner of my room. I flicked on the lights to find Bugsy laying on the floor, having just fallen from my bedside table. He was face down, limbs splayed out to either side. It was like he was trying to maximize his body-to-carpet contact. Without thinking, I pulled him into bed with me to cuddle. I had forgotten all about the heat warning. I fell asleep quickly. It always helped me sleep when I had something warm and fuzzy to cuddle. But once again, I woke up in the middle of the night to something strange. There was a strange tickling sensation on my arm, where Bugsy was pressed against me tightest. I turned the light on and looked to see if there was a loose stitch or something, but I couldn't find it. It unsettled me. I put Bugsy back on the floor and finally got some rest. The next night, I swore I saw him slithering over to the heating vent on his belly like a snake. It was dark, but I know I saw it. It was slow, sluggish, but he was moving. After that, I always made sure to keep him in my toy chest whenever I wasn't playing with him. As the season turned to summer, we were hit with a massive heat wave. I was walking around the house in my underwear at all times. My diet consisted of 60% ice pops. All the blinds were drawn to keep the sun out, and box fans were running in almost every room. My room was the hottest in the house, much to my displeasure. On the hottest day of the heat wave, I was up in my room, melting into the carpet. I didn't even have the strength to play with my toys. I was so hot, all I could do was lay on the floor in my undies and talk to Bugsy. I remember him looking bigger than usual. Not by much, but it seemed like he had somehow gotten more thoroughly stuffed since the last time I saw him, like he was bursting at the seams. Delirious from the heat, I hugged him close to my chest. I could feel him moving. Not like usual, though. He wasn't just moving an arm or nodding his head. No, this felt different. It was like his body was rippling, bubbling like a pot of boiling water. I rolled over onto my back and held him up over my face at arm's length. A bead of sweat dripped down the side of my head. I wanted a better look at him. For a moment, he just rippled there in my hands. That was until a tiny black spike poked out from the side of his head. It bent in the middle and moved back and forth like it was clawing at the hot, humid summer air. And then another emerged. And another, in an instant. Bugsy's body had been pierced all over by these tiny black spikes. One of them brushed up against my hand, and in a moment of panic I tensed up, inadvertently squeezing Bugsy in my grasp. I heard a soft crunch, like crushing a piece of popcorn between your fingers. Then, a sickening pop as the seam on his neck burst open and a roiling mass of black spiders poured out onto my face like liquid spilling out of a Ziploc bag. I did not close my eyes and mouth in time. Do you know what it's like to feel something moving behind your eye? A sharp, spindly leg scraping at your optic nerve? Something trying to crawl down your tongue and down your throat? In a moment of panic, I clenched my jaw to try and keep the things out. I could feel dozens of arachnids pop like a mouthful of tapioca pearls in my mouth. My own screams were drowned out by the sound of these things trying to dig down into my eardrums. These things wanted to get inside of me. They wanted my warmth. Even the ones that spilled onto the carpet quickly began crawling all over my body and into my eyes, my nose, my mouth, my ears. It felt like for every one I crushed, two more found their way inside of me. I do not remember much of what happened next. I don't remember screaming, and I don't remember my parents rushing to my aid. I know it happened because they told me about it afterwards. But all that is a blur. All I remember is the sensations. Eventually, it was too much to bear, and I passed out. I woke up in the hospital feeling sick to my stomach. A very kind doctor told me that they'd taken care of everything. They had to pump my stomach and flush out my eyes, nose, and ears. Thankfully, most of the spiders died pretty quickly. As badly as they wanted heat, they couldn't handle it. This meant that thankfully, none of them had the chance to lay any eggs. I barely paid attention to what the doctor was saying. All I could think about were those spiders pouring onto me like a thick syrup. Back at the house, my dad had called pest control to see if they could take care of any remaining spiders. The pest control people looked, but they couldn't find any. Every single one of Bugsy's spiders had made their way inside my body. It took several weeks for me to recover. Not physically, I was fine after 2 days in the hospital. But mentally, you don't forget something like that. I still have nightmares. I still get flashbacks whenever I see a spider. Any bug, really. It's awful. One look, and I'm back in that room, holding Bugsy over my face. The toys were recalled. Apparently, it wasn't just me. I wasn't the only kid to find out what was inside of those things. Spiders, in every single one of them. One kid choked and died. Another went blind. The company issued a half-hearted apology statement and went under within the week. They didn't mention the spiders at all, only talking about the incident in the vaguest of terms. Pretty much everything about the company has been scrubbed from the internet. I can't even remember their name. Bugsy's gone too, except for a few stories and videos you can find from back before they were recalled. At least I can only assume so. I can't ever look at that thing's smiling face again. There's no good place to end this story off. I guess I just needed to get it off my chest. I'd only told it to my parents who saw it firsthand, my therapist and that friend I mentioned earlier. She was the kid who went blind, actually. The spiders went straight for her eyes. Make sure you check your child's toys carefully around Christmas, I suppose. I'm gonna stop writing now. I feel sick. The tree was ancient, older than the village, older than the first settlers who arrived on bullock carts and mules, seeking to carve out new lives, older than the stars themselves, if you believed Granny, and I did. It was enormous, its gnarled trunk twisting like a coiled serpent, draped in a suffocating cloak of vines, and leaves thick enough to rival a small forest. No bird or squirrel dared to make their home within its shadowy branches. When I was 17, I learned why. Every month, on the night of the full moon, a single family was chosen to conduct an elaborate puja beneath the tree. The ceremony required sweets, vermilion, sacred red and yellow threads, and most crucially, a live chicken. From my first experience of the ritual, it was clear that while families could economize on everything else, the chicken had to be perfect. Local birds were pampered, fed the best grain, and allowed to roam freely. Broiler chickens were strictly forbidden, and wealthier families like the Chatterjees paid a hefty premium to import Kadaknath roosters from Kolkata. The better and richer the bird, the more successful the ritual. The puja itself was straightforward, at least on the surface. The chosen family would proceed from their home to the tree in a solemn single file, accompanied by the steady rhythmic beat of pipes and drums. They'd sit cross-legged, heads bowed, while the family patriarch recited age-old prayers passed down through generations. The trunk of the tree would be anointed with vermilion, threads tied delicately to the lowest hanging branch, and then the chicken's throat would be slit with a sharp, small blade. Its blood would pool at the roots, seeping into the soil as if it were drinking greedily. The patriarch would dip 3 fingers into the crimson puddle, sprinkling drops onto the trunk, and then the family would rise, offer the sweets as a token, and return home. There were 2 unbreakable rules. First, no one was to look up at the tree's boughs while the ritual was in progress. Second, once it was done and the worshippers were leaving, no one was to glance back at the offerings and the lifeless body lying on the roots. Breaking these rules, they said, would invite untold misfortune upon the family, dark, mystical, and irreversible. The few times it fell upon my family to perform the puja, I did follow the instructions to keep my eyes pinned to the bark, but it was all I could to avoid slapping at my neck, which something rough and filament-like brushed now and then. I was certain of something watching me, watching all of us, from the shadowy branches, but I didn't dare look up. In Indian villages, curses and forbidden rules are taken a bit more strictly regardless of how modern you are. What lives on the tree? I often asked Granny as she rubbed coconut oil into my locks. Nobody knows Baba, she would reply, chewing on her areca nut and betel leaf preparation. It has stood there since before my great-grandfather's time. Some say there is a spirit at the top, an angry, hungry spirit. Spirit or not, as the years passed, and I grew up, my curiosity only thickened. I would spend an hour every afternoon hanging around the tree, trying to glean some arcane secret from its silent dark green facade. It just stared back at me stolidly, marked by years of blood sacrifice and frayed threads. Generations of villagers had prayed here for rain, good crops, healthy calves, and protection. Many believed an aspect of Kali resided within its scarred bowl. One frigid winter, it was our turn once more to perform the puja. Baba called me to him and fished out a 500 rupee note. Go to Karim and get a healthy rooster. I nodded, stuffing the note into my pocket, but as I headed down the winding road towards the bazaar, a different idea began to form. The new bakery had opened up just last week, and I could almost taste the greasy, flaky mutton patties they were famous for. Besides, it wasn't like anyone would notice if the rooster was a little less than perfect, right? When I arrived at Karim's, the shop was buzzing with activity. Chickens clucked nervously in their cages, their beady eyes darting around the room, while the butcher's knife glinted under the dim yellow light. Karim barely glanced up as I walked in. "Oh, back again?" he said, wiping his hands on his stained apron. "Got a good batch today. Take your pick." I pretended to inspect the birds, lifting a few by their wings, checking their feathers and weight, just like I'd seen my father do. But my mind wasn't really on the task. I eventually settled on a rooster that looked decent enough. Still feisty, but with a slight droop to its comb that suggested it wasn't the healthiest. I knew it wouldn't pass my father's scrutiny, but I could save a good 100 rupees this way, maybe more if I haggled a bit. "Not this one, Karim. Its step's too expensive," I said, feigning indifference. "I still take it if you knock off 50. Karim raised an eyebrow. "That one? Its step's not the best bird I have, you know." "Exactly," I replied. "Which is why you can give it to me for less." He sighed, muttering something under his breath about kids these days, but eventually relented. I handed over the cash, pocketed the change, and set off to the bakery. I felt a rush of giddy rebellion as I bit into the steaming, flaky patty, savoring the rich, spiced mutton. I even splurged on a pack of cigarettes, slipping one between my lips as I strolled back to the village, the cold air prickling against my skin. By the time I got home, my father was waiting in the courtyard, his arms crossed. He took the rooster from me, holding it up to the light, turning it this way and that. His eyes narrowed as he inspected it, and for a moment, my heart leapt into my throat. But then he just sighed, shaking his head. "Looks a bit scrawny," he said, "but it'll do." The night was colder than usual. Durga Puja had just ended, and the October air seemed intent on freezing my very bones as we set out from the house. Ma, Baba, Dida, my little sister Mithi, and me guilty, with the faint smell of smoke clinging to my jacket. I had absorbed the essence of goldflake earlier, huddled in the backyard. The tree loomed out of the fog like a monolith of terror, skeletal branches reaching desperately for the sky, leaves rustling softly in the wind. We quickly lit a series of diyas, placing them around the roots for meager warmth and a flicker of light. Baba began chanting the mantras, and we stood with our palms clasped, eyes dutifully lowered, not daring to look up. But my other senses remained firmly tuned to the branches above. There it was again, that prickling on the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Strands of something brushed against my skin, and at one point, I could have sworn a drop of warm liquid splashed onto my head. I swatted at it, but my hand met only empty air. The rooster clucked nervously, its wings flapping as Baba gripped it tightly in one fist. With a quick practiced motion, he slit its throat using a thermocol cutter. Blood gushed out, thick and sticky, drenching the trunk and seeping into the roots. Baba circled the tree, dragging the twitching carcass in a wide crimson arc before tossing it aside. "Come, time to go," he said, his voice sharp in the cold night air. We turned and hurried away, legs moving as fast as they could without breaking into a sprint. I strained my ears listening for anything out of place, but there was nothing, just the bristling of branches and the sighing of a sudden breeze. Dinner that night was quiet, almost somber. Baba looked distracted, while Mithi complained of a mild headache, and Ma took her to bed halfway through the meal. I forced down the watery fish curry with potatoes and then retreated to my room at the far end of the house. Sleep, however, remained elusive. I must have managed to drift off for a few hours when the sound of shattering glass jolted me awake. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the light switch, only to find there was no electricity. But in the pale, eerie glow of the gibbous moon, I could see it clearly, a heap on the floor beneath the broken window. It was a dead rooster, partially devoured, stringy flesh hanging from cracked, sucked-clean bones. Horror clutched my heart. It was a naked, alien terror. Was someone playing a prank on me? I stooped and touched the carcass with trembling fingers. The flesh looked like it had been set upon by sharp teeth, but teeth that did not belong to a dog or cat. I knew something about bite marks given my rural upbringing. Something brushed against the back of my neck, light as a whisper. I froze, muscles locking in place, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out everything else. The realization sank in like a stone sinking through dark water. There was another presence in the room with me, something huge, lurking just out of sight. I had to break the age-old taboo. I had to look up. I looked up. She unfurled from the ceiling like a dark, twisted bloom, her hair spilling in a tangled, endless curtain that brushed the floor. Black fur bristled along her muscular arms, claws digging effortlessly into the wood, and her eyes, those sickly yellow eyes, glowed from behind the curtain, watching me with a hunger that tightened my chest. Her lips stretched into a grin too wide, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. The creature pointed at the rooster. "Bad chicken," she rasped. "Mommy, why do things die?" I turned to my son, from the stove. He sat at the worn-out cream wooden table, his feet dangling towards the tile, too small to touch the floor. "Where did that question come from, honey?" I asked, laughing, and turning back to the cooking bacon quietly. "Pop, sizzle, pop." "Mr. Nate Sepp's cat?" he replied. "Pop, sizzle." Well, I guess sometimes, when someone or something is very old, or sick, or has been hurt in a way that can't be fixed, they die. That means their body stops working. Death is a natural part of life. I paused. "Did something happen with Mr. Nate Sepp's cat Seb?" "Pop." She told me she sits dead. "He was good, my boy, Sebastian. He used to sleep all through the night. Him, a baby blue blanket my late mom crocheted when she found out I was having a boy, and the baby monitor right next to his crib. I felt like I was blessed to have such a quiet baby. He never fussed or made a mess. Even when he began to speak, he always said, 'Yes, ma'am,' or 'Yes, sir.' People would stop and say, 'You must be a wonderful mother teaching your boy such manners at this young age.' They stat smile. I stat smile. Sebastian would smile. He was such a good student, too. Always came home with a project or another. I didn't have to ask him to get good grades. He just knew. I think he knew that it was just me and him. His dad split when he was 1. Now at 7, he had the biggest mind of all the third graders in his class. His teacher called me one day to tell me he'd be the next Einstein. I was so proud to think that maybe I, a single mom, could have parented the next Einstein. When I think about him now, in this moment, I guess I never should have been a mom. Everything started going downhill when he brought up that cat. Mr. Nate's cat is really scared, Mom. She said it's dark in there. She wants to meet you. I just brushed it off. Laugh. It hadn't even been a few days since he brought this cat up. What was I supposed to do? I tried telling him she couldn't talk. She can't do that. Cats can't speak, right? I thought that I should put an end to it. But how? I finally decided that when Seb was at school, I would go to Nate's house and see what all the fuss was about. Walking up to the door, I didn't think anything was wrong, but the redwood and golden knob taunted me in the faded fall sun. Nate was an older man, late 60s. He'd always been there for me, and Seb, after Seb's dad left, he called me his surrogate daughter in a way. His had died when she was 20. Leela, car accident. Nate didn't like to talk about it. It definitely ate him up inside. I just didn't think it was my place to ask. Knock, knock. No answer. Knock, knock. No answer. The door creaked open. That was unlike him. Nate never kept his door unlocked because of his time in the army. He didn't like the thought of anyone, random barging into his house unwanted. He knew me though, so I walked in. It was dark, unusually dark. Nate liked to keep a light or two on if he wasn't home, but there were none. So I assumed he was home, at least somewhere home. Nate? I called, looking around the house. Sofa, side table, lamp in the corner, a recliner chair in the other corner facing towards the TV. Dark books piled up on the coffee table in an erratic fashion. His house smelled sour. I walked into the kitchen, disgusted. On the island was a carcass, a rabbit, cut up in weird ways. Clumps of fur scattered on the counters, strange symbols on the cupboards and fridge. Its legs bent back. It was still breathing. I covered my mouth with my hands and ran towards the back of the house, nearing the bedroom. Nate, there, lying in bed, symbols drawn all over the walls, carved into the wooden bed frame. He lay with his hands folded like he was in a coffin. A photo of his daughter Lila sat on the dresser beside his bed, a red circle drawn around the frame, a lock of hair right in front, candles burning to emit a smoking plume that caked the room, and around Meow. That cat came out from underneath his bed. I left. I ran. I went straight home into the bathroom and locked the door. This was the time that Sebastian would be coming home from school. The bus should be dropping him off in front of the house right about now. I should have dinner cooked. I should be doing laundry. I should be setting the table. But I couldn't. I couldn't do that. He was dead. Nate was dead, and that cat was just there. She wasn't dead. But he was. What the fuck was going on? Mom? I found Layla outside. She said she wants to meet you. She said you saw her. How sipped you see her. She knows where you are. That last sentence, quiet, soft, calculated. What happened to my good boy? I didn't set answer. How could I? Footsteps approached the door. I can hear him and the scratching at the door. It's been an hour. His little hands aching for his mother. Or were they her paws? Faint meows and begs heard from outside. Mom, meow. Mom, please let me in. Meow, please, mommy. My face is tear-streaked, and mascara runs down my cheeks. My phone in my hands, shaking. I'm writing this from the bathroom. The door is locked. I can't call anyone. There's no one to call. Just me and Seb. And that cat. Well, I think I should rather say where he was. And that's the thing that really creeps me out. But to tell you that story, I have to give you some background information. Growing up, my life wasn't what one would call rosy. I'm an only child and not even a wanted one at that. At least if you could ask my mother, she might tell you. Then again, she probably would lie. to keep up appearances. Those times when she told me how she really felt about my existence were only ever in private, and more often than not after something bad had happened. Either when she was holding an ice pack to her face, cooling the new black eye, or after she had fallen down the stairs drunk. She wasn't a good woman, and even less of a mother. My dad, on the other hand, was something almost worse. He wasn't the abusive one, at least not to me, or well, at least not in the beginning. I still have memories of us visiting the park and playground. Him pushing me on the swing, while I laughed. That was the main difference between my parents. My mother would have done something like that as well, but only so other people could see how normal our family was. Dad didn't give a shit about that. He never cared about what anyone else said or thought. All that mattered to him was himself. What brought him fun? What cured his boredom? He liked to drink, yes, but he wasn't a mean drunk. I never once remember him hitting me or even screaming at me when he stumbled home from the bar or beating my mom when the beer ran dry. That wasn't his style. The cruelty he displayed was done stone cold sober, and in a way that makes it so much worse. The parents fought almost all the time, between my mom calling my dad useless and a piece of shit, spitting on him, and him tripping her, shoving her face first into walls, or making her cry. My upbringing really felt like hell. As I said before, Mom was the more obvious abusive one, at least to me. And the older I got, the more I became her personal lightning rod. If Dad hit her, she hit me. He punched her for mouthing off. She'd make sure I would feel her pain. He made fun of her life. She'd do her best to make me cry. Well, at least I wasn't popular at school, so I didn't have people who could witness that stuff. The only one who saw and knew what was going on was Dad, and more often than not, he thought it was funny. I do remember him chuckling when Mom managed to make me cry, and almost howling with laughter when she pushed me, so I fell and hit my head on the edge of the table, pulling down a bowl of cereal in the process. Yeah, that was my dad. Always looking for things that made it interesting. Well, he did start actively participating in the crueler stuff once I hit puberty. He started getting this strange look on his face from time to time. This grin felt so cold and cruel. I still shiver when I think about it. Once I saw it, I knew that something was about to happen. Sometimes he would hit me when I walked past and delight at my pained groans or shrieks. And I always reacted because, not giving him the satisfaction only led to a second, harder punch. But he at least kept aiming away from my face and only hit my body where almost no one would see the bruises. Of course, I tried talking to teachers about it, but only once. It happened when I was about 14 or 15. My coach saw a giant black bruise on my ribs and asked me about it, and I foolishly told him the truth. That was when I think everything began to change. Police were called, as was CPS. They turned up at our home, and Dad played innocent, while Mom supported him. Of course she did. What would the neighbors think? That night, Dad woke me up with his big hand pressed on my mouth and nose, while he asked me if I would prefer it like that. I struggled and tried to push his hand away, but he kept me in place with what seemed like the greatest ease. He began insulting me, threatening me, making fun of me. The only thing I remember vividly is how my arms and legs started to shake, and I felt myself passing out in the darkness. When I came to again, Dad was gone, and the house was silent once more, but from then on, he got far more vicious. To me and Mom. Sometimes I was startled awake by my mother suddenly screaming in pain. Other times, I found her sitting on the floor, crying. I know how fucked up that sounds, but I hugged her and told her that we could just leave, because even after all that messed up stuff, she still was my mother, and I was scared for her. Well, I think back then, sitting on the floor of the kitchen next to her, she had her first and only genuine conversation with me. She told me that we couldn't, that Dad would find us, as he always did. Twice before she had tried, when I had been just a baby, but he always knew where we were, she warned me. I think about that conversation from time to time, especially now. It's giving me the creeps. Half a year later, she was dead. I think I was 15 by then, when I came home from school, and immediately felt that something was off. There was this noise coming from inside the house, reaching me, as I stood in the doorway, and I felt my legs going weak. The sound of Dad hitting someone. Something I had heard so many times before, yet in that moment, I immediately realized that it sounded different. I really wanted to turn around and run, to leave on my own, but my body didn't listen to me. Slowly, I walked into the house, toward the source of those dreadful sounds, and I think you can already imagine what I saw. Dad was standing over my mom's lifeless body, with that strange grin on his face, still hitting her over and over again. That sight has been seared into my mind. I've spent years in therapy, yet can't shake it, can't stop myself from waking up, screaming, almost every night. Back then I was sure I would be next, that in a matter of seconds he would be upon me, beating me to death as well. But that didn't happen. He just turned around to look at me, then smiled and told me to call the cops. "This is going to be interesting." "Just sec," he said. It took me what felt like an eternity to call the police, while he still kept on hitting that lifeless, broken, and bloody corpse on the floor. The cops showed up and took him away, yet all the while he still had this creepy smile on his face. I would love to say that my life got better from then on, but, the prosecution wanted me as a witness. But in the end, they decided they didn't need to put me through the trauma again, as Dad was completely cooperative on his own. He was sentenced to life in prison, and I was put into the system. It wasn't overly cruel, but since I was almost of age, no one bothered to do much with me anyway. I stopped getting beaten, at least, but the mean comments and cruel jokes were replaced by almost complete isolation. As I said before, no one wanted anything to do with me. So even if I knew that I should have been happy, my life didn't really get better until I finally turned 18 and could set off on my own. I struggled and fought to carve out my own life, and after years of setbacks, I think I finally managed to get at least a semblance of what one might call normalcy. Working hard, in my case, actually helped. I own a small, rundown house in a bad but affordable neighborhood. I have a steady job, and have managed to get promoted a few times already. The only thing I'm missing in my life is company. Well, I think you can guess why I have trouble with that, especially now. You see, Dad has written me letters. It started pretty soon after he was incarcerated. I know, I shouldn't even have opened them, but back then I felt like that was the only connection I still had with anyone. I only wrote back once, but he didn't even mention anything about what was in my letter. As always, everything was about himself. He told me what had happened after the trial, how he didn't care a damn thing about what anyone thought, stuff I expected. I got long, almost rambling letters about prison life and the people he met in there, who he liked and who he hated, how one of the wardens mistreated him, then a month later, how that man had died in an unfortunate accident. Sometimes I read those messages out of boredom. Other times I threw them out, but at least once a month I got a letter in the mail, addressed to me. I thought it would stop after I left the orphanage. But no. No matter where I stayed, it always found me. He always found me. Just as my mother said. I got a letter when I moved into a small, shabby apartment, even one when I was homeless for a few weeks and slept at work. Of course, I tried to ask the prison he was in if they were responsible for that, but they denied any involvement outright. I even got one as soon as I bought this small, rundown house. It greeted me when I stepped onto the curb as a homeowner for the first time. The first letter in my mailbox, and it was from the man that fucked up my life. I read through it, and the content was almost as I expected. Someone had come at my dad with a knife and had soon found themselves in an accident. Prison food was boring, as was the routine. It wasn't interesting anymore. I could feel sweat breaking out all over my body as I read those lines. Old memories flooded my mind. He hated being bored. That was always the time when things got worse. Another letter followed. 2 weeks later, all it contained were 5 words. "Seeing you might be interesting." I called the police as soon as I had read it, and they assured me that everything would be fine. Damn liars. I know something is off. Someone called me yesterday, asking me if I had heard anything. There are police cars driving up and down the street in front of my house, every half hour. I think he has broken out of prison. I can feel it in my bones. Something is coming. Thinking back now, that last letter was different. No postmark. The shit. My university has tunnels connecting all of the buildings on campus. I've been told by my friends from other places this is pretty unique, but I think a lot of schools around here have them. Maybe they just want to make sure students don't have an excuse to miss class when wind chill reaches -50. Maybe they don't want us all to starve if a blizzard lasts a little too long. In any case, these tunnels crisscross under the outdoor sidewalks and green spaces of our college, guiding students, staff, and faculty alike wherever they need go. Most of us who live in the dorms use them daily in the winter months, even if we might eventually pop outside occasionally for some fresh air. I don't think anyone wants to brave the elements for their 8 a.m. class when they don't have to, though. The tunnels are not uniform in their construction, and some are absolutely sketchier than others. Some are made up of aging plaster walls, poorly lit with burnt-out construction-style lamps, inexplicably always damp. Most of the shittiest ones go between dorms and parking garages or cafeterias, places they knew they could cheapen out as much as possible. Some of the dorms aren't much better above ground either. The place I want to tell you about, and its tunnel, is one of them. Let's call it Gray Hall, so I can maintain some attempt at anonymity. This shitty dorm must have been hastily and cheaply constructed in the 80s. It always leaked, and had walls so thin you could hear your neighbor as if they were speaking directly to you. Honestly, I get the sense that this building has been begging to be torn down practically since it was new, and the last 40-some-odd years has not done anything to help that. Blizzards, minor floods, a few rough hailstorms. Gray Hall has seen the worst this state had to offer. It's probably a miracle they squeezed the years out of it that they did. It took first a student breaking this wrist in the stairwell, when they lost their footing on a cracked step, and then another one managing to push out a window and fall from the 4th floor before the university finally stopped using the building altogether. As far as I know, the kid that fell is still in the hospital. There was just too much maintenance needed all at once, and the university couldn't risk any more lawsuits or bad publicity, so they closed it completely after the fall semester. I think they were also tired of addressing all the complaints about it. Everyone hated living there, and would escape given any chance they had. By that point, there were probably only a dozen students living in the entire massive thing, and heating it during January probably wasn't worth it either. They closed the only tunnel to Gray Hall before they finished moving all the students out, and said it was the most structurally unsound part. I'm sure that's true, but there is more to it. More that I wish I didn't know, more that I wish I could just forget. If I weren't a senior here, I would have dropped out already and driven as far away as possible. I can't tell the world. I gotta graduate, but I can at least tell you. I live in the next dorm over, so every day I kept walking past the large barricade they'd placed at the entrance to the unusually long tunnel to the condemned hall. It always looked like overkill to me. Why was there a tarp hung floor to ceiling, like it was some kind of construction zone? I was certain they were trying to scare us away. I guess it was pretty successful, well, for most students. Not me, though. I'll admit maybe there is something wrong with my instincts, but the only thing I felt each day was a growing sense of curiosity that was harder and harder to ignore. On a Saturday night a few weeks ago, I made my first mistake in a series of poor choices. I tried hard liquor for the first time, half a red Solo cup full of vodka later, and my inhibitions were eroding by the second. I was at a small party with my friends just off campus, and everyone was at least a little bit tipsy. One of my friends had the bright idea to play Truth or Dare. A lot of the game was spent licking nasty shit, making people embarrass themselves. And of course, there were a few raunchy moments between players too. One of my friends, Mike, who happened to live in the same dorm as me, claimed my dare later in the game. Dude, you set been wondering what the deal is with that abandoned gray tunnel. Haven stud you. I caught you staring at it last week, and I thought for sure you were casing the joints. You were looking for weak spots to break in. I shrugged and tried to take a casual sip of vodka, somewhat unsuccessfully. I mean, yeah, of course I do. It steps so menacing, for like no reason. There has got to be more than just a crumbling hallway, right? Well, I dare you to prove it, Mike said, slapping his hand on the ground with drunken enthusiasm. I rolled my eyes. I'm not gonna die, 'cause some loose brick falls on my head. Even drunk, I'm not that stupid. That made a few of the others laugh. But my friend wouldn't be deterred. Okay, we still put on like gloves and our biking helmets. We tow. I pushed. Well, yeah, now I want to know too. And I still make Jim come along. My friend's groggy roommate looked over at the sound of his name. Wait, what? He asked blearily. Mike playfully smacked at Jim. Come on, idiot. We start going on an adventure for Rachel Sips. Dare. Jim groaned loudly. But I stepped so comfy, Mike started tugging him to his feet. Well, that sip's just too fucking bad. Get up. It took a bit to find all that we would need to pry our way through the barricade, given that we were still inebriated. However, a few folks at the party decided to help us out. One even lent Jim a spare helmet when he realized he'd left his at his parents' house. We left the party to cheers of encouragement, but as we stepped into the cool evening air, quiet surrounded us for the first time. It left us each in our own silent contemplation as we crossed the street onto campus. What if security catches us? Jim asked softly. I could only shrug. I guess we gotta make sure that doesn't happen. I can keep watch, Mike volunteered. I couldn't help but laugh. I don't know, Mike. I think you might need to sober up a bit more first. Mike crossed his arms over his chest, but couldn't refute that. When we got to the blockade, we debated how to get through without making our intrusion immediately obvious. It took a bit of awkward scrambling and teamwork, but we got through without tearing down the tarp that covered most of the entrance. Mike was the first one on the other side. He blindly fished his phone out of his pocket and put on the flashlight. When Jim and I joined him, we each did the same in turn. Scanning the walls and ceiling, it was clear that the tunnel really was pretty badly in need of repair. There were cracks and missing plaster everywhere, dramatic holes in the ceiling, and several lights were broken. This tunnel had always been a little spooky, but illuminated only by our phones. It was downright unsettling. This tunnel tilted slightly downwards because Gray Hall's basement was lower than the ones in the buildings around it, and that night it looked like it could be a tunnel straight to hell. It seems my fear had finally caught up to me. I closed my eyes and took a few deep breaths. It was then that I noticed a horrifying smell. I grimaced and turned my head away for a moment. Mike had already started walking, so he was now a few steps ahead of me. All three of us were now completely silent as we crept carefully forward. In my head, I told myself it was because we didn't want to alert anyone we were down here, but I knew they were just as scared as I was. We were quickly nearing the end of the tunnel where it joined up with Gray, but there was a slight turn before that happened. Mike reached it first. He stopped dead in his tracks, gasped, and frantically scanned the ground with his phone's light before falling backwards, shrieking. That wasn't a sound I'd heard him make before. I rushed forward to see what he was looking at. There, below a broken concrete ledge, in a shallow divot in the ground, was a torso of a rotting human body. My brain could only process the scene in pieces. In the beam of my phone's flashlight lay at least 3 bodies, all dismembered, some horrifyingly contorted, their skulls tipped in silent screams, and blood stained every last scrap of clothing that was visible. One was an older woman, one was an older man, but the third was a guy who was young enough to be in one of my own classes. I stumbled backwards like Mike had, but tripped slightly and dropping my phone. It fell screen side down, causing the light point upwards and illuminate the entire shallow grave before us. Beside those first few bodies, which were probably at most a few months old, lay fully skeletonized remains. Their clothes looked older, like way too old-fashioned and weathered to be from any time in the last few decades.
What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?
I muttered frantically, shaking my head as if trying to clear my addled drunk thoughts like an etch-a-sketch. I heard Jim retching a few steps away over my shoulder. Mike was now shakily trying to scramble to his feet. We gotta get the hell out of here, man. We have to go. We can't be here. Holy shit. He stammered incoherently, still staring at the corpses before us. He finally turned, and as he reached me, he shook my shoulder. Now. We have to go. Now. He was shouting. I was also struggling to avert my eyes from the crime before us, but I did manage to lean down and clumsily retrieve up my phone. As Mike began to sprint away, I forced myself to turn and follow him. I could hear Jim only a step or two behind me. Our exit over the barricade was not as graceful as our entrance, and it was now pretty obvious someone had gone through it. We barely had the sense to care. We paused for a minute, in the better lit intersection of the tunnels. I can't go back to my room, my roommate. I don't know what I'd say. Where the hell do I go? I met first Mike, and then Jim's eyes for the first time since our discovery. They looked at each other and seemed to silently and instantly come to an agreement. Rachel, come to our dorm. I know someone with a cot we can borrow if you want. Just please, stay with us, at least tonight, Mike asked. The weight of his words were heavy with fear and concern. I swallowed and began to nod my head. looking at Jim again, who attempted to offer an extremely half-hearted smile. Let's go, was all I could say in response. We started to head down the tunnel that lead to our dorm building, but as I passed by a staircase, I stopped dead in my tracks. Actually, you guys, can we walk outside? I know it's cold, but I didn't need to finish that thought. As my friends seemed to be relieved, I thought to offer an alternative to staying down here any longer. The night outside barely seemed dark to us now, as we trotted anxiously towards our home for the school year. The sounds of the late winter night were faint but still reassuring. Luckily, Jim and Mike lived on the first floor, so it didn't take us long to get in and collapse. I perched on one of their desk chairs, bring my knees up against my chest as I hugged my legs. There was a long, heavy silence, as both boys sat on the floor nearby. Jim spoke first. We have to tell someone. I nodded mechanically in response. Okay. Well, like who? Anyone could have done that. Security, a professor, another student. I don't think we can trust anyone. Mike sounded frustrated, and it was clear paranoia was starting to set in for him. That question and observation inspired another extended pause full of dread. Those people weren't all killed at the same time. Jim was quieter as he spoke. Do you think it was a whole group of people that did it? Like a secret blood cult frat or something? Like as a ritual once every few years or something? Mike asked. I couldn't help but snort a brief barking laugh. Mike's head snapped in my direction as his glare shot daggers at me. I put my hands up defensively. Sorry, dude. I don't mean to like shit on that theory. This whole thing is so cosmically fucked up and unbelievable. It feels completely unreal. Like, sure, why not a blood cult fraternity? Anything is possible now, I guess. Mike sighed. I shouldn't have dared you to do that. We could still be shit-faced at that party, just doing stupid shit like licking a toilet seat instead. I still probably would have thrown up, Jim offered. That made Mike and I laugh for real in a way that genuinely eased the tension a bit for the first time. Maybe we should figure it out in the morning. We could try to sleep, or at least rest. I proposed half-heartedly, knowing deep down that any time I actually closed my eyes, I would probably only see those pale, bloated faces from here on out. Mike looked unsure, but Jim agreed with me. We decided to turn most of the lights off, but kept on a single desk lamp. I was sure the boys would tease me for asking to have a little more light, but they seemed just as reassured by the idea. It wasn't possible to get the cot that night, so they tossed me a few extra blankets, and I made do. I balled up my sweatshirt as a makeshift pillow, and just stared up at the ceiling. Luckily, it was already almost 4 a.m. by that point, so daylight was only a few hours away. I must have managed to doze off at some point, because I woke up to Mike swearing again. As memories of last night began to return to me, I felt myself paralyzed by dread. Rachel, I saw you open your eyes. Come on, you gotta check your email. I groaned loudly, and with a lot of effort, I managed to force my arms to move. Mike, can we I don't know, grab some coffee or something first? I asked, desperately hoping to delay the inevitable. Mike shook his head as he clambered down from his bunk. He shoved his phone in my face, and I blinked a few times before grabbing it. On the screen was an email that appeared to be addressed to all students. It was from our school's president, and the subject line read, "UArgent Safety Alert." The email went on to describe a break-in at Gray Hall. Anyone with any leads could report them to campus security in exchange for more dining dollars. Any staff or faculty perpetrators would be fired. Any current student perpetrators would be expelled, and any former student perpetrators could have their degrees revoked. The school was already working with local authorities, and if the school's punishments weren't already enough, anyone caught could face jail time. The message was clear as day to me. We know that you know, and you better keep silent. I threw the phone back to Mike and curled up again. Does mean they already know about the bodies? Mike asked, still in disbelief. I just shrugged. I don't know, Mike. Maybe they knew about them all along. He furrowed his brow. What do you mean, Rachel? I mean, you know the rumors as well as I do. They only closed Gray Hall to avoid more bad press. I don't know that they actually care that Daisy or Ishwak got hurt. So what do we do now then? I shrugged again. Pray we can still graduate. What if they kill someone else? Someone we know? What if they kill one of us? I looked him in the eyes and replied in a cold, deadpan voice. Well then, I guess I hope whoever finds me under the concrete is less of a coward than I am. I'm a med student. I was just meant to observe. Maybe assist. Nothing in our textbooks or training prepares you for this. I'm writing this from my locked bedroom as something he moves around my house like an animal, only quieter, more intentional. Please, someone tell me what to do. I don't know how long the door will hold. It started 3 weeks ago. I'd only just begun my first rotation, internal medicine. I was shadowing my supervising doctor at St. Thomas Spur. He was sharp, old school, always wore a bow tie, and never seemed rattled. I looked up to him, still do. The man didn't blink during a code blue, but he'd always said, it's the quiet ones you watch closely. Not the screamers, the ones who smile when they shouldn't. I didn't get it at the time. My first solo case, just a basic consult, but my supervising doctor let me take the lead, was a man listed as patient 46B mid-30s. Slight build. No emergency, no urgent flags, just unexplained bruising. He sat calmly in the consult room. No obvious injuries. Pale, thin lips. Brown hair that hung limp, like it had given up. But his eyes, that was the first thing. They were gray. Not blue-gray or hazel gray. Just gray. Unsettlingly blank, like a fogged-over mirror. He spoke slowly, politely. His voice low and toneless. Said the bruises started appearing 3 months ago. Inner thighs. Upper arms. Spine. Places you'd expect with abuse or a bleeding disorder. I examined him, and yes, there were bruises, but they were wrong. The edges weren't purple or yellowing, like healing ones. They were pitch black, with a red core, as if something inside was trying to get out. I remember asking if he was on any blood thinners. He said no. I asked about substance use, alcohol, anticoagulants. Never touched a drop, he replied with a smile that felt like someone else's mouth wearing his face. I was unsettled, but I had to write something down, so I chalked it up as possible. Immune thrombocytopenia. Gave him a mild corticosteroid prescription and told him to return in a week. We still run more tests, I said. Probably nothing to worry about. I regret those words. When he returned a week later, things escalated. He looks thinner. Same dark clothes, same blank expression, but there were more bruises. His neck now, around his jawline, and several across his scalp like blotches of ink. He didn't sit this time. He stood in the corner of the consult room, facing the wall, like he was in timeout. Lucas? I asked. That was the only name he kept given. You okay? I can hear them now, he whispered. In the walls. They want out, but they like you. I glanced at the mirror, wondering if this was some elaborate psych eval trick, but it was just me, alone, with him. He finally turned. His pupils were dilated, almost consuming the irises, and there was blood under his fingernails. I don't scratch, he said, as if reading my mind. They move around inside me. I stopped not doing it. I referred him to our liaison psychiatrist. I also requested a follow-up with internal, something didn't add up, physically or mentally. We still get you seen again soon, I told him. Just hang in there, okay? He nodded. You should lock your doors more, especially after dark. You start warm. They stipped like to wear you. The next day, I visited the psychiatrist's office to check in on the referral. The secretary looked up, confused at first, then her expression shifted. Something quieter tinged with sadness. He has instead come in. You have instead heard. Heard what? She hesitated. He was found dead. Last night, bludgeoned, in his office. Police think it happened after hours. We sex are closed today for. I was already walking away, ears buzzing. I didn't want to believe it was connected. Couldn't be. But I felt it in my gut. I called the station. Asked to speak with the detective in charge. I got bounced around until someone finally took me semi-seriously. Yes, the voice on the other end said. We stirred looking for a patient, mid-30s. Gave the name Lucas. Used a fake address on the intake form. No ID. We stared, advising all staff at St. Thomas Sipstas to stay alert and avoid contact. The detective lowered his voice. We found things in Dr. P. Stepp's office. Blood in places it shouldn't be, symbols carved into the carpet beneath his chair, and something under his fingernails. Not human. That was 12 hours ago. I've been trying to act normal since. I finished my shift early, told the nurse I had a migraine, took the tram home, looking over my shoulder the whole time. And now this. I came home, and the house was dark. I live alone, in a 2-story terrace. Usually it feels cozy. Not tonight. I locked the door, flicked the hallway light on. He was there, not standing. On the ceiling. Pressed against it like a spider. Barefoot. Clothes torn. Skin too pale. Almost translucent now. The bruises had overtaken his limbs, crawling up his face in broken inky veins. But it was his expression that paralyzed me. A smile so wide it stretched unnaturally, as if his cheeks were tearing from the force of it. His eyes, they were solid black now, not just the irises, all of them, like 2 obsidian marbles reflecting my horror back at me. He didn't speak. He just moved. Not like a person, his limbs twisted at angles no joint should allow, slow and jerky like a puppet handled by someone who's never seen one before. He crept across the ceiling toward me. I wanted to scream but couldn't. My throat locked up. I stumbled backward, hands shaking, keys falling to the floor. He dropped. No sound, just thud. Right in front of the door, blocking it, standing there now. Head tilted, arms hanging limp, still smiling. I ran, bolted up the stairs, locked myself in the bedroom. I barricaded it with a chair and a shelf. I don't know if it'll matter. He hasn't still spoken once. But he sits knocking now. Not on the door. On the walls. Knock. Knock. Then silence. Then knocking from the other side of the room. I swear to God I heard him giggling. I called the police. They said they'd dispatch someone, but there's been a surge of emergencies. Said it'll take 30 minutes minimum. I tried to explain that a patient might have killed a psychiatrist and is now in my house. They said, try to stay calm, sir. Maybe step outside. I can step. He steps everywhere. The lights keep flickering. My phone battery's at 9%. I can hear him moving in the ceiling above me now. Sometimes dragging something. Sometimes whispering my name over and over. Doctor. There's steps of scratching coming from inside the closet. I didn't check it. I didn't think to that. Wait. Oh God. The closet door just creaked open. It's pitch black in there, but I can see something moving. Long limbs. That smile. He was never downstairs. He said's been in here the whole time. Please, someone tell me what to do. I stump posting this in case I don't make it. The cops are 20 minutes away now. My bedroom door just creaks. Blood date. Noises have stopped. No knocking, no whispering. Just silence. I think he sits waiting. If you read this, please share it. And if a patient with gray eyes, blood under his nails, and bruises that don't heal ever walks into your clinic, run. Like many children growing up, I had an imaginary friend. In the mid-90s, a few years before I was born, my parents moved into a very nice home in the Midwest boonies. The remote location significantly cheapened the property, and my parents were able to afford it alone off my dad's income. He had developed a now still relatively popular website that was growing fast at the time. The nature of his work didn't require him to leave home, so the remote location was not an issue whatsoever. Because they were so financially secure, and my mom no longer needed to work, they decided to have me. That house was admittedly pretty isolating. The neighbors' properties were hundreds of yards away, and most of them were pushing elderly status. All their children were grown and lived their lives somewhere else. Yes, I had friends growing up, but I only saw them at school. I didn't make my first friend until I was in kindergarten, let alone actually stood face to face with another child my age. But because I only saw other children at school, it prompted me to conjure an imaginary friend. I remember naming him Samwise after the Lord of the Rings character. My parents were huge fans and had read the books to me. They even took me to see it when it first released in theaters. I'm sure other moviegoers were confused as to why a couple had brought their 6-year-old child to see Lord of the Rings, but I loved it. I know this sounds creepy, but to me it wasn't. Samwise and I played in our acres of backyard forest, gathering ancient artifacts, broken glass and rocks in nearby riverbeds. Hunting with bow and arrow forged by the heavens to slay the legendary mythical lion, my late dog Sandy, who enjoyed retrieving the foam sticks, and generally partaking in other grand adventures to embark on together. At first, my parents were supportive toward my imaginary friend phase of life. I'm sure they were aware of the isolation I was feeling and assumed this was a healthy outlet. When they set the table for meals, there would be 4 spots instead of 3. They even went to lengths as far as putting together an extra meal for Samwise to eat. Now that I look back, that may have been why we ate leftovers so often. Either way, their reaction was positive. Sometimes too positive. One time my parents had set the table for dinner. This time there were 5 plates of food. I remember asking, "Why are there 5 plates?" "Well, Micah Sepp's gotta eat too, buddy." My dad responded. I didn't know who Micah was. I had never even heard of the guy. I looked over at the usually empty portion of the table that now contained a plate full of food and silverware. My parents looked at the spot too, making facial expressions as if reacting to someone. "Francis, could you please get Micah some water?" my mom asked. I got up excitedly, knowing they were playing a fun game of pretend with me. I filled 2 glasses of water for Micah and Samwise and brought them over to the table, returning to my seat. My parents began smiling and glancing at me. "Oh yeah, that's Sip's Samwise, Francis Sip's friend." I chuckled. Filled with joy, I waved toward the new empty seat. "Hi, Micah," I said giddily. "Yes, he is the sweetest," my mom said in reference to me. My parents were amazing at playing along. It felt real, like there really was somebody there. They would small talk with the absent figure, and occasionally laugh and nod their head in response to nothing. Then, they looked at me. For an uneasy period of time, their expressions became confused. "Francis, be a good boy and talk with our guest," Mom had suggested with a low-key tone that suggested if I didn't, I would get in trouble later. I had felt anxious at the sudden request to socialize with something I couldn't see or hear. I was questioning whether this had turned into some psychological form of punishment to show me how annoying I was with Samwise. But that didn't make sense. My parents liked Samwise. I froze up in the confusion, bouncing my glances between my mom and dad like a tennis match spectator. They both had looks that said, "Well, get on with it." The awkward silence and embarrassment of the moment appeared too much for them. They dropped their attempt at making me communicate with Micah. I said, "I'm sorry. He gets a little shy sometimes." "Francis, why don't Set you go to your room for tonight? Don't Set forget to bring Samwise." I went to bed feeling guilty and confused. A swirl of emotions pulled at my prepubescent heart. I tried to forget about it and went to sleep, but something woke me up. It was my parents, talking and laughing in the dining room. There would be long pauses and equally long responses. They would periodically chuckle in the ominous silence, as if they were talking to someone on the phone. Then I heard my dad, "See ya, Micah," and the front door slammed shut. After that day, my dad would tell me he was going out to see Micah. What they did together, I have no idea. Other days, my parents would invite Micah over. Those days I would sit in my room and listen as they conversated with nothing again. Day after day, night after night. Until one day I was suddenly awoken from sleep once more. My dad was yelling outside my closed bedroom door. I remember hesitantly calling out to my dad. His response was blaring. "Stay in your room, don't sit, come out." I was scared. I was scared because my dad sounded scared. I had never heard panic in his voice like that. He continued shouting, "Go leave." And like every night Micah came over, his visit ended with a shutting door. Their imaginary friend must have done something bad because the next morning my parents told me he wasn't allowed over anymore. But of course, in the mind of a confused child, I didn't know what to believe. I knew Micah wasn't real because I never sensed his presence. Obviously, if he existed, I would have seen him, heard him, smelled him. You know? Because of this, I bottled it up inside, as my parents' attempt at convincing me that none of us were allowed to have imaginary friends anymore. My parents never spoke of Micah again. They never even acknowledged that he had ever visited our home. just like I hadn't when I was 6. A recent incident caused me to remember this story, and countless others, but I can share a few that absolutely stood out to me as odd. A few years ago, I went to a theater to see an independently funded film. Because the film was independent and wasn't advertised heavily, only a few theaters had showtimes for it, the closest theater being an hour away. The movie theater lobby was packed, and I was afraid the movie I drove so long to see was sold out. I approached the ticket booth, and nobody was there. In a frantic attempt to obtain some tickets, I searched around the halls of the theater for whoever manned the ticket booth. Outside the numbered theater doors, a theater employee found me first. To my surprise, he introduced himself to me with a tight grip on the shoulder and a question. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, speaking formally with an accent of anger. "Why? What did I do?" I asked, confused. I thought a prank was being played on me. "You have to buy a ticket to see a movie." "Dumbass. You rudely ignored my coworker in the booth. He told me you just walked right past him, and when he told you to stop, you just kept going. So please, exit the theater before we escort you ourselves." He was dead serious. If it was a prank, it was tasteless. As I walked out the theater, I glanced at the ticket booth one more time. Still, nobody was there. Another instance of me being rude. I was checking out at the grocery store, found an empty line, set my items on the counter, and waited as the cashier rang them up. But the whole time she gave me annoyed glances, scoffed at me a few times even. It might have been because I accidentally hit an empty card in the way of the cashier aisle with mine. I was honestly too lazy to move it by hand. The weirdest one was at my own job a few days ago, which prompted this whole finding out what the hell is wrong with me thing. I work at an office call center for IT. A coworker of mine, who had worked there since I started, stopped showing up one day. Nobody acknowledged it, so I chalked it up to just him quitting or getting fired. Then I saw a photo of him on the accolades wall for most efficient employee of the month. I thought they were pranking me, and I laughed when I saw it. They asked what I was laughing about, saying that he worked really hard. I thought maybe he passed away and I didn't hear about it, and this was maybe some weird way to commemorate him until I was cornered in my office. Shelley, an older woman, began berating me about this workplace. Is a families and everyone here is equal, so treat them as such. I had no clue what she was talking about, and even considered submitting a complaint to HR. The whole thing seemed so silly to me that I began thinking of this possibly dead coworker as the office's imaginary friend. That thought is what kick-started my trip down memory lane. Conjuring the memory of Micah, my parents' imaginary friend, I realized how weird that whole concept was. They definitely weren't teaching the counter-imaginary friend tactic in any parenting books I had heard of. I found the time after work to call my mom. After a few "how was your days?" and "I'm good, how about yous?" I asked about Micah. She paused for a moment. "I'm surprised you remembered that whole thing," she said. Chuckling awkwardly, she continued. "Micah was your dad's old friend from high school. He actually emailed your father congratulating him on his success as a website developer and entrepreneur. That's what sparked their momentary rekindling, I suppose you could say." Her voice grew weary over the cell phone speakers. "Wait, Micah was real?" I asked, profusely puzzled. "Well, of course he was real. But we should listened or acknowledged your feelings toward him. I mean, when you were a child. You obviously saw something wrong about him." "We didn't set cash." "What do you mean?" I asked again. "Well, honestly, I don't think you liked him very much. You never talked to him, never said hi, never even looked at his direction. He would try to give you a high five, and you would walk right past him. My badass little 6-year-old. That's why we had you tested so young." I asked her to elaborate on that. She mentioned an autism screening, one I had totally forgotten about until our conversation. Because of how I was treating Micah at the time, my mom brought me to a pediatrician in what I now understand was for an autism test. I understood that they asked my mom a lot of questions about my development, which makes sense. I remember taking tests and answering questions. I had thought this was something every kid ends up doing. They found that I was not on the autism spectrum. However, the pediatrician found something else about me. When you are alone in your room and you want to calm down, where do you go in your thoughts? The pediatrician had asked me this after the topic of hiding in my room to avoid uncomfortable situations emerged during the session. What do you mean? I remember asking. Well, when I'm feeling sad, I like to imagine I'm sitting on a paddle boat, slowly drifting on a lake. It's like meditation. Have you heard of that word before? She asked curiously. Yeah, I responded. Okay, Francis, where do you picture yourself when meditating? On a mountain with the other cool fighters, I said gleefully. I had heard of the word. It was from a kung fu movie I used to watch. The main character would meditate to become stronger. So of course I answered based on that impression. Can you describe it more for me? She asked, paying close attention. Oh, there's Sep's birds up there, I think. You think? Tell me what you see, she said, and began writing in her notebook. A couch, you, your desk, the dog photo that's on your desk. I was very careful to observe my surroundings in the office room. No. Francis, what do you see in your mind? Close your eyes for me, please. Can you see the mountain with the Sekul guys' seps? Can you tell me what color their costumes are? Are their costumes stained with dirt from training on the mountain, or are they careful to make sure they sec or clean? I had no clue what she was talking about. I could describe what I thought I saw on the television show, but I couldn't see it as she kept repeating. That was the day I discovered I had a fantasia. Essentially, one who has a fantasia cannot utilize visual imagery in their thought processes. The best way to describe it is as such. Think of an apple. 1. Can you see the shape of the apple? 2. Can you see the color of the apple? 3. Can you see the texture of the apple, such as indents, scratches, or rough brown skin? Generally, most people can see these to some degree, detailed or not. To me, the apple does not exist. The pediatrician mentioned aphantasia to me and my mom, as if it was a party trick, nothing to be concerned about, just a little quirk I happen to have. During the early 2000s sex, aphantasia was not something well known or well studied. It just happened to be something she knew about and treated it as if it was no big deal. As the memories of banal waiting rooms and multiple sessions with the pediatrician flooded to the front of my mind from a previously untapped reservoir of thought. Your father heard scratching in the middle of the night that woke him up. He thought he left Sandy outside and felt awful about it. So he got up and turned on our bedroom light, which I yelled at him for, but he needed to find his shoes. Anyways, Sandy was sleeping soundly in the corner of our room, so then we thought it was a bear trying to break in through our front door. Your dad grabbed his hunting rifle from our closet and left to check it out. Instead, he saw Micah had broken into our home and was clawing at your bedroom door like a rabid animal. Thank God you were asleep. If you had left your room, I'm sure you would have been traumatized for life. I sure was after that. I heard your father yelling, Micah, what the hell are you doing here? I interrupted my mom. Wait, why the fuck was he clawing at my door? I asked, tightening my grip on the phone. Your father and I talked about that later. We couldn't think of any sure reason, but he did mention saying something like, there is no room for the blinds, and I can show him more than he sees while your father was aiming the rifle at him. He said his face was absolutely unmoving, like stone the whole time. That man was delusional. After the cops took him, we never heard from him again. Thank God. I thanked my mom for telling me what had really happened. She asked if I was really okay, and I told her we could meet soon for dinner. Hopefully she could explain more of what happened to me in person. I'm also posting this because I'm scared. I've started to think of more similar instances, and each time I come to the conclusion that maybe someone was there. Does anyone else have experiences like this? If so, I'd really like to hear them. If you know more about this than I do, please feel free to help me. I'm freaking out. Traveling in a beautiful, lesser-known city, I made a mistake. When I was traversing this dazzling place, I came across many wishes, at least, that's what I assumed them to be. A large elephant shrine sat shrouded by red, yellow, red, and white tokens, all in a line on a string, dangling down. A bell was at the bottom of each string. Each one had something written on it, mostly in Sharpie, in a language I unfortunately didn't understand. After seeing this, I was under the assumption that these were wishes, placed here by locals, and perhaps some tourists. The beauty and seriousness of the whole display made me think that perhaps it was actually real. I don't know why, maybe I'm a selfish person, but upon the understanding that wishes could come true, I didn't think to write one for myself. Instead, I decided I would take existing ones off, That way I could have more wishes than I could count. Of course, there was the problem in that I didn't know what any of them said. I figured there was no harm in it. These people's wishes had already come true, right? Another problem I ran into was that this was an immensely crowded tourist area, kind of hard to take one unnoticed. So I decided nightfall would be the right time. After continuing the rest of my day like normal, I waited until 3 a.m. to make my heist. I brought a pair of scissors and cut down the first one I saw, stuffing it into my pocket. My thought process was, I'd better just try one at first to test it out and not give too much suspicion. I figured it would be noticeable if a large chunk of them were gone all at once. I also took my wish from the back of the display for safe measure, since it was less likely to be missed, and the person who wished for it probably already had their wish fulfilled. I walked back to my hotel, lounging around on my bed. I didn't feel any different. I suppose this was a problem. If these wishes really worked, how was I to know when it was fulfilled? It could be anything. Then I had thought of using a translator app and running the wishes through that to see what it said. However, these were written in a local language, which as far as I know cannot be translated this way. I was ready to call it a night, checking my phone as usual when I spotted something. Opening my bank account, I was greeted with a new deposit, $1 million. I was over the moon. It really worked. Of course, this led me to a few more questions. Had I scammed someone out of their million? No. Surely they must have spent theirs by now, right? So it must have been fine. To say I hit the jackpot was an understatement. I just so happened to pick one of the most generic things you could wish for, but that was a great thing. I couldn't believe it. It really worked. And the first wish, $1 million, what luck. I could have stopped there and been content for the rest of my life. Matter of fact, I should have stopped there, but I didn't. Greed took a hold of me. I stole 2 more. The first one I didn't notice until I had to take a piss. Well, let's just say, someone wished for a little extra manhood. It was no $1 million, but I certainly wasn't complaining. The next one was admittedly a little odd, and it took quite a while to notice. The next day I kept noticing a butterfly of the exact same color everywhere I went, without fail. So this person wished for a butterfly to follow them around. Okay, these were starting to get weak. Again, I should have stopped at this point, called it quits. This just wasn't right, but I couldn't help myself. This time I yanked a whole string of them from the furthest corner, where it would take someone a long time to notice they were gone. I sure wish I hadn't. I received a phone call shortly afterwards. It was the police. We're calling in regard to your family. You may want to sit down for this. Oh God, what did he mean by that? My throat dried up. I listened to the gruff officer speak, tears welling in my eyes. My mind raced. What was I to do now? Who the hell wished for their immediate family dead? God, I really fucked up. But that was only the first wish of 6. Surely this couldn't be right. No one would ever wish for such a thing. I guess it's possible someone was abused by their entire family, but I don't know. It just seems like too much to wish your loved ones dead. I couldn't believe it. As I had these dark thoughts, I noticed something was different. My vision was suddenly super clear. It felt like everything was blurry before. Okay, I thought. That's not bad. Wishing for better sight seems like a reasonable request. When I arrived back at my hotel preparing to pack my bags, I looked into the bathroom mirror, only to be greeted with a disturbing sight. Right in the middle of my forehead was an extra eye. It was huge, bigger than my regular eyes, and it didn't blink. I couldn't take this anymore. Why were all these wishes so strange now? What happened to the basic ones? I hoped a Lamborghini would show up under my name any moment. I still had 4 undiscovered wishes. I just wanted to go home. Then the strangest thing happened. As soon as I pictured my home in my mind, well, I was there. I didn't know how that was possible. I was just in another continent on vacation a split second ago. Now I was back in my house. Teleportation made sense. I'd have wished for that too, so I decided to continue to try it out. But where should I go? My best friend Aaron, he always had answers, and well, frankly, I was hoping he could help me get out of this predicament. I did worry, however, realized that he would probably be totally freaked out by the whole thing. Teleportation. 3 eyes. It was enough to scare the shit out of anybody. But still, I felt like I needed his advice. So I closed my eyes and pictured his apartment. With a whoosh, there I was. When I opened my eyes, I was in his living room. However, something was horribly wrong. The wall and ceiling was coated in fresh blood and human bits dripping down to the floor. I darted my head around, spotting littered bits of bone and chunks of hair. I turned around to see my best friend Aaron, what was left of him anyways. Half of his body had been completely splattered. The other half lay crumpled on the floor. I screamed. Oh God, what have I done? That butterfly circled around me carefree, as if taunting me for my awful choices. I still didn't know what my remaining 3 wishes were. It was dark by now. My eyes had adjusted enough to help me move from one pool of streetlight to another. Last night, like most nights after dinner, I like to take a walk around my neighborhood. If time permits, listening to songs or occasionally podcasts on my phone. I was lost in my thoughts when suddenly I came to and realized I was standing in front of a street sign. It said Zyrleth. As far as I remembered, I never stepped off the sidewalk, and yet seeing asphalt beneath my feet meant I must be standing on said street. Which was strange too, considering I had been walking down Summit, which is uninterrupted from Cole to Tin. I looked down the northern end of the street and saw the sign for Cole, and I turned south and saw the sign for Tin. The houses on either side of the road looked like the ones I was remembered seeing here, but I just never recalled seeing a street between them. I looked down the street and it looked unremarkable, perhaps disarmingly so. It snaked around, and before it went out of sight around its own curve, it could have easily been any other stretch of street in my neighborhood. Though truth be told, I'm about as curious as I am oblivious, so embarrassingly, it wouldn't be impossible for this to have been there the whole time. But now regardless, I was conceding to my curiosity, so I started walking. The road went on beyond the curve and continued to wind lazily away, never a side street and never ending, far, far longer than any residential street I've ever seen. Nothing immediately stood out as being particularly unusual. The houses all varied in their style and shapes, but overall nothing specific seemed particularly out of place. This was true for about a mile. It was about at this point that the houses were starting to feel strange to me. I couldn't really place it as anything specific. Maybe sometimes a door felt slightly too big, a window off-centered, or the dimensions of the walls were unusual. It would only take about another half-mile before I could voice exactly the individual things wrong. One was a door that didn't meet the ground. It was nearly a full foot from the walkway that led to it. Then I saw a house where there was no door at all, only some windows. I decided to take a look. This would be the first time I would have left the road, but I walked up to the window and looked inside. I could barely see anything at all, but really I shouldn't have been able to see as much as I could. In the corner of the room, I realized there was a dim flickering bulb, barely had any strength at all, but was casting just the slightest amount of light into the room, enough to display its contents. The room otherwise seemed to have furniture, but it was strange, and I couldn't figure out how you were supposed to use them. If they were meant to be sat on or hold things or act as storage. Each seemed just slightly impractical for any one of those purposes. I took out my phone and held it up to take a picture. My phone flashed as it took the photo. It was so bright and so sudden that it made me feel immediately uneasy, as if up until this point I had been able to visit silently, but now had announced myself so stupidly to the world, to this world. I put my phone away and quickly returned to the road. I kept walking. The houses kept getting stranger. Windows became slanted, doors too thin to walk through. Sounds seemed to echo from inside some of them. I decided not to investigate these. The road kept going, and I kept following it. Only now seeing the rule break had I realized the rule at all. Until this point the roads and yards had been spotless. No trash caught from the wind or junk left out front. While I love my neighborhood, it's not unusual for a derelict car or something more mundane, as a broken flower pot or old rusty yard equipment to be found out front. There had been none of this. Until now, as the strangeness of the houses began to increase, so too did it seem the trash increased. Specifically, the trash I was seeing seemed to be mostly dirty pieces of fabric, strewn about, mostly on the roads, but some appearing in the yard. I assumed this was probably the type of trash fallen out of trash cans until I tripped on something. It was a shoe, a small shoe. It was about time for me to leave. I decided. But an element of my curiosity was still demanding an answer, and as it was, my courage had returned enough after being dulled by the window incident. I needed to know what it was like inside a house before I left. I decided to find a house, specifically one of the ones without noise coming from it. I looked around and saw a house that most of its peculiarity was in the fact it was around 4 stories tall, with each floor having a vastly different shape than the ones above or below it, looking like a stack of jigsaw pieces. But for my needs, the bottom floor had many windows, and most importantly, a door I could fit through. Silently, methodically, I paced toward the house, unaware that as my foot left the road, I began holding my breath. Through the windows, I could see the inside well enough to make out the cavernous quality of the interior, empty, with the exception of a couple sparse pieces of furniture strewn about or protruding from walls. This was a good sign, I decided. I don't have to go anywhere out of sight, just a quick step in, then out. As this thought finished speaking itself, I startled as I realized I was at the door already. While my nerves were quickly changing, there was no reason to abandon the plan that hadn't existed when I made it. So I reached out. My hand landed on the odd, irregular knob. I gave it a slight turn and felt the tension of the door leave as it was ready to swing open for me. I took a deep breath and pulled it back a few inches. I hesitated and my hands began to shake. Okay, fine, I thought. Just open the door, look from here, or if I stump feeling especially daring, stick a foot inside, and that can technically slam. Before I could finish the thought, the door pulled hard against me, and the knob flew out of my hand. The door slammed shut. Click. The bolt on a lock slid shut. It was time to go home. I spun and shot back toward the road. Desperate to return to the road, I didn't even realize in my terror until I nearly reached it that it wasn't vacant anymore. Hello, neighbor. He took a drag from his cigarette. Blew out at me. I froze. Standing in the road was a man, dressed in a black suit, white collared shirt, black tie, and by all measurements looked extremely normal. His face was clean shaven, dark hair slicked back. The first giveaway that he was not the same normal as me was his eyes. They didn't seem to point accurately. They weren't quite aimed at me, but I was positive his full attention was on me. There also just seemed like too much white in his eyes. Then he smiled. Normally I do it all at once, but he seemed to choose to do it one muscle at a time, first one side, then the other. Finally, as he lifted to smoke again, his arm moved aggressively and jittered to bring his hand to his lips. Now I was sure we didn't have the same bones. I'm almost ashamed to admit that it wasn't until he poorly mimed taking a drag by moving his hand to his lips, then doing nothing with his mouth, that I realized what was in his hand wasn't a cigarette at all, but a finger. A small human finger. I turned and ran. And ran and ran and ran. The back of my throat ached and my legs felt rubbery, and I wanted to quit until "Hello, neighbor" rang out behind me. Far too close, louder than before, and coming from higher than before, like I was being spoken down to. I didn't look back, fearing if I did, I may trip or just freeze in fear. I ran and ran until I saw the cross street and the Zarelith sign that had led me here in the first place. I let whatever energy I had left carry me over, and the moment I crossed onto Summit, I collapsed and fell rolling into the road. A moment later, I got back to my feet to see what may have followed me, but instead saw the 2 houses that had previously flanked Zarelith, adjacent to each other with only space enough for a thin walkway to a backyard between them. It was again how I had remembered it before. I've never again seen the street, nor can I find any record of it existing anymore. Before I fully doubted my sanity, I remembered to check my phone and my pictures. The picture of the window does exist, though of course that proves nothing to anyone as far as evidence for the truth of my story, as you can barely even tell it was supposed to be a window of a house. All you can really see is me awkwardly trying to take the photo, and even that is blurry. But even with the blur, you can vaguely make out behind me the outline of a man apparently having a smoke. Side up Tom went mad, Sitz Gilbert said. Sitz schizophrenia or something, I think. He stopped, leaving the place completely. After a month of being pent up inside, he died of starvation. Sitzo, he was a hoarder, a serious one. It took weeks to get the home cleaned up, and even then, there's still some junk in the basement the cleaners left there. I be curious to have a look and see if there's anything valuable. With steps he snorted. Said doubt it, though. Said doubt it. I sorted through what remained of the clutter and determined most of it to be worthless. There were shelves full of dusty tools and stacks of used furniture. Shoved up against the wall was a large mattress with dirty, stained sheets and old clothes piled on top of it. There was one thing I uncovered which did catch my attention. In the far back corner of the basement, something was hidden underneath a white sheet, a chest, turned back to face the wall. Within the chest, I discovered a diary and a stack of paintings. I skimmed through the diary first. Below, I sips copied out some of the stranger entries as I read them. I had one of the oddest experiences of my life today. It started with a dream. From what I could recall, I was fleeing from something. I don't remember what it looked like. I know it was huge, on a cosmic scale, and it wasn't supposed to exist. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but describing the thing at all is difficult for me. I woke up from the dream with my head throbbing and sweat covering my body. My throat was dry and raw. My ears were ringing. Something felt wrong. When I went outside the following morning, what I saw was bizarre. It looked like a bolt of lightning had struck the ground at the edge of the stretch of hayfields extending past my backyard. The immediate section of corn was blackened and withered, the corn further out a sickly brown color. In the center of the circle of scorched earth sat a hand-sized stone totem. 4 uncanny faces decorated each of its sides. They appeared almost but not quite human. 2 were screaming, the other 2 bore grins which extended unnaturally wide. The piece of stone was stained on one side with a blotch of reddish-brown. The previous homeowner took the totem back to his house and put it in the basement. The next couple of entries deliberated over various other aspects of his life. I was intrigued enough to keep skimming through the diary, and my curiosity was soon rewarded. Something happened to one of my paintings. I'm writing this down to help me understand it. I have owned the painting for years. It has been here since before my parents moved in. It's the type of thing you live with for such a long time you never really notice it. Yet now every time I sit in the room with it, I swear I can feel the painting watching me. He went on to describe the painting, an old man sitting on a table with a walking stick in one hand, the other holding a pair of spectacles up to his eyes. When he had examined it closer, Tom noticed something about the painting had changed. The man looks different. He looks scared, and there is a long, tall shadow in the shadows behind him, only barely visible, but it's definitely there. After a couple days, I took it off the wall and put it away in the basement. That was when I noticed the idol had fallen off the shelf. It had been sitting on. It has shattered into several pieces. The idol no longer gave off the sense of malice it did when I found it, but that's not to say the feeling has gone. It hasn't. I went back down to the basement. I checked on both the remains of the idol and the watercolor painting. I previously described my discomfort being around the portrait of the old man, but that instinct is gone now. The painting itself appears normal again, just an old man staring at the viewer with an expression suggesting him to be deep in thought. Upstairs, I have a couple of other portraits hanging up around my house. One is of a little waterfall in a forest. Now out of the corner of my eye, I swear I can see something staring out at me from in between 2 trees within the painting. I thought it had to be my imagination, but when I succumbed to paranoia and took a closer look, I realized it wasn't. When I peered close enough, I caught the shadow of something tall in the trees, hunched over to the side at an odd and unnatural angle. More of the portraits in my house have been changed. These changes are both subtle and unnerving. What is stranger is that when one painting changes, the others change back. The shadow of the thing inside the waterfall painting has disappeared. I want to know if what is going on here can be explained rationally. And if it can't, I want to understand what the hell this thing is haunting me. I've thought about it, and I believe getting rid of the remains would be wisest. I can't emphasize enough how uncomfortable it is to share a house with it. The thing possessing my paintings, which must be somehow connected to the fetish. I hate being around the paintings once they've changed. They're not so bad after they've changed back. But whichever painting possesses the visual anomalies feels alive. Not just alive, but hostile. I honestly feel like the thing inside the paintings despises me. I'm not overly superstitious, but I'd be an idiot to deny there was something evil about the idol I discovered out there. Getting rid of the idol didn't work. Getting rid of all of the paintings I've spotted changes in didn't work. It keeps switching between other portraits all around the house. The most recent one it took possession of is a landscape portrait of a small, old-fashioned neighborhood from the 1930s. Something is staring out at me through one window, no more than a hazy blur in the grayness of the glass. I took it down and put it away with the other ones. The following entries described how it moved from one image to another. Tom subsequently developed a phobia of being around portraits and avoided them religiously, going as far as to lock every painting he owned away in his basement. His entries became less and less coherent. He discussed how his world was falling apart. The account he wrote painted a sad picture of a depressed and lonely man who needed help but didn't know how or where to get it. I could hardly make sense of the last couple entries. They read like the ramblings of a madman. I wasn't surprised since Gilbert told me he had been diagnosed with multiple mental illnesses in the years leading up to his death. Tom scoured his house repeatedly looking for paintings. He claimed to discover different pictures hanging off of his walls every couple of weeks. It became a daily ritual to check his house to make sure no new ones had appeared. He was convinced something awful would happen if the Wraith, as he had begun calling it, was left outside of his basement for too long. This was where the readable part of the journal ended. The remaining entries were impossible to make sense of. I took the journal upstairs and sorted through the paintings. They were the same ones the author described. The one at the bottom of the pile was a depiction of a procession of gaunt soldiers from what looked to be WW2, trudging over the remains of a weathered battleground. The soldiers' eyes were fearful and haunted, their faces stark white. This photo scared me in an inexplicable way. The longer I looked at it, the more mad and deranged the faces of the soldiers appeared. The sensation I felt while around it mirrored the one the author had described. A steadily growing sense of uneasiness, which made it difficult to gaze upon the painting for too long. One of the first things I did with the portrait was take a photo of it on my phone. Tom had done the same thing a couple of times previously, and made a dubious claim. According to him, the effects the portrait had on him didn't extend to photos of it, no matter how many he took. He was right. The portrait looked distinctly different on camera. The faces of the soldiers appeared more grim rather than haunted, and the one furthest to the back of the procession wasn't grinning in a deranged way, the way he was in the original picture. I took a couple more photographs, still not quite able to believe it, but they all showed the same thing. At a housewarming party, I showed the war portrait to some friends. They each shared my discomfort when they looked at it. Some of them didn't get the feeling of dread I described immediately, but one by one they each succumbed to it. When I showed them the photos, they confirmed the differences I noticed were real. They complimented me on my photo editing skills, and I had to explain to them that I didn't do any of this. When I proved the fact by taking another photograph, one of my friends came up with an interesting theory. He suggested a special kind of paint could have been used to make the painting appear different in the light of the camera as a picture was being taken. Keen to get to the bottom of the mystery, I began testing some of the other claims made by Tom in his diary. I placed the WW2 portrait next to a collection of creepy photos I'd found online and printed out. The first time it happened was with a photo of a pale, angular face leering out of a dark background. I couldn't say precisely when it occurred, but the Wraith took possession of the photo. What had once been a piece of paper with a generic scary image printed on it was now a dark, almost oppressive presence lying on my desk beside me. Something else happened too. The WW2 portrait changed subtly. The soldiers' faces now looked like they did in the photos I took of the portrait. It worked just as Tom had described in his journal. Whenever I wasn't looking directly at one of the photos, I could swear the face in it had turned around to stare at me. I frequently looked to check this wasn't the case, but this did little to curb my anxiety. The effect of the photos seemed to be cumulative over time. The longer the Wraith inhabited one photograph, it began as a persistent and intrusive feeling of uneasiness. The longer I spent around the photographs, the more they troubled me. The white, angular face began showing up in the corner of my eye. I began to understand why Tom spoke of the portraits the way he did, and why he hid so many of them away in the basement. If I shared the same room as the Wraith, I couldn't bring myself to remain turned away from it for too long. Or to look at it for too long, either. And I wasn't the only one who felt that way. My friends all shared the same sentiment. Once we played a game to see who could look at one of the possessed photos for the longest. The best of us lasted 9 minutes before shuddering, turning away and leaving the room. There were things the Wraith could do, which Tom never learned about, but I did. All of what I'd seen so far was only the beginning of what the Wraith was capable of. One rainy day when I was stuck on a class assignment, I elected to take a break and went out to get a coffee. When I came back, I noticed something looking back at me from my computer screen, which hadn't been there before. It didn't take me long to pick out the subtle differences in the photo on my screen and deduce what had happened. The wraith had transferred itself onto my computer. What I was looking at was a digital copy of the same leering face I showed you earlier. No copy I made of the image file replicated the cognitive effects of the possessed image or the visual differences the wraith had made to it. Modifying the image itself didn't do anything at first. When I changed it too much, the wraith abandoned the image and reattached itself to another one in the same folder. I put another image into a parent directory, deleted the possessed one, and waited for a response. I didn't have to wait long. The wraith did what I'd predicted it would do, moving to the image in the other directory. A couple of days later, I managed to get it inside of a GIF. The image depicted a girl standing and staring at a reflection. The animated loop was of the reflection leaning forward and beginning to push its face into the other side of the mirror. The wraith added an extra second to the end of the GIF, showing the reflection melting through the glass on the girl's side of the mirror while reaching out for her. This difference was disturbing enough on its own, but I could have sworn the GIF was changing a little more each time it played on my screen. From time to time, the GIF would pop up on screen unprompted, stuck in its ceaseless repetition. I began to feel a vague sense of dread while using my computer, as I feared another occurrence of the wraith flashing up on my screen. It was a stupid thing to be scared of, but I struggled to shake the feeling off. Recently, I'd watched a slasher flick, and I decided to see if the wraith would interact with it. Like with the other media, there were tangible differences in the possessed version of the film. The murder scenes were more graphic and lasted longer. The movie concluded with a 10-second shot of the murderer staring into the camera expressionlessly with no music or noise. Upon watching the movie for a second time, several more scenes played out where various characters stopped, fell silent, and stared into the screen as the murderer had done. The movie mutated further each time I watched it. Scenes became glitched, and the subtitles turned into an incomprehensible jumble of characters from a language I couldn't identify. After showing the movie to my friends, they were as unable as I was to explain what they saw. They had seen enough to be convinced the wraith was real, even if I wasn't so sure of the fact myself. However, none of us were scared by the idea. We were fascinated. We were debating what it meant when one of them brought up an intriguing suggestion. This little group of ours was in the middle of working on a horror game. It was a passion project. The 5 of us, Mice, George, me, Nick, Hayden, and Matthew, had envisioned during our first year together at college. The wraith can inhabit all kinds of media, Sip to George said, leaning in. What if it could inhabit a video game? At his urging, I moved the possessed movie file into the game folder on my computer. When this didn't have an effect, I deleted the file the wraith had possessed. It turned up in an image file again. This time, a texture within the game. The game we were working on was an exploration of a large, liminal landscape. There was little story or background, just wandering through an eerie world with an atmosphere inspired by titles ranging from the old Silent Hill games to active worlds. Even though little in the game had been tangibly changed, playing it was a totally different experience. There was an unshakable sense something was hidden in the game with us, something which wasn't supposed to be there. George in particular was blown away by what the game had become. He got it into his head that we had to find a way to put the wraith into all copies of the game. Then we would release the game and everyone would get to experience what we did while playing it. He was certain it would be a massive success if we could achieve this minis. He went as far as to claim it might end up being one of the most successful indie horror titles of all time. I brought up the significant issue with his plan. There could only be a single copy of the haunted game. My friends could only experience the game like I did when they played it on my computer. Streaming or otherwise recording the game couldn't effectively recapture the effect playing it had. He suggested running the game files through a special program to create duplicates of the wraith. Though it seemed like a dubious prospect to me, I agreed to transfer the file onto a USB drive to give to him. He was convinced he could pull it off, and his excitement at the idea was contagious. For the next couple of months, George dedicated himself to development of the game. The work he did during this time was impressive. In one live stream, he toured us through a life-size sports stadium and a fully furnished shopping mall. He wanted the experience of the game to be unique for everyone who played it. For this, he had decided to make the world procedurally generated. It was an overly ambitious goal, but George was adamant he could pull it off, and he already had the code to prove it. The progress he'd made was great, but it wasn't what we cared about. We wanted to hear about what he'd done with the Wraith. George admitted he was struggling to control the thing. It was skipping through files in the game too fast for him to keep track of. He assured us he would get on top of the issue and fulfill his promise. We just needed to be patient. George was a binge worker. He was typically either procrastinating or feverishly working on something. We were used to seeing him worn out after staying up late completing an assignment the night before it was due. I bring this up to explain why we weren't initially concerned when we noticed the way George looked during classes. We did get a bit worried when he started skipping classes and missed a pair of exams. That concern evolved into worry when Nick overheard he'd bailed out on a family reunion. We reached out to him. He admitted his insomnia had come back. He tried to play it all off like it wasn't a big deal, and promised us he intended to see a doctor. 2 weeks later, George shared with us another milestone in the game's development. The Stalker was a new idea. George had added into the game. It would come out after a certain amount of time had elapsed in-game. The Stalker was supposed to be a physical manifestation of the feeling of something hidden just behind every corner and lurking beyond the walls of fog that the Wraith elicited. We were a little peeved. He'd updated the game in such a major way without consulting with any of us. We might have argued about it. However, George was the lead developer of the game, and currently the only one working on it at the time. Over the course of the 2-hour live stream, he wandered the empty landscapes of the game searching for the Stalker, and we sat watching him. For the first 30 minutes, he traversed a metropolis, full of stone-still figures staring out of windows from buildings rising unnaturally far into the sky. He wandered around a town square, with an oversized circular fountain, where every building was obscured by a dense layer of stagnant mist. The creepy atmosphere of the game was offset by banter between us as we watched him play. Yet there was only so long we could fill the void of silence as George roamed restlessly around the empty world. He remained uncomfortably quiet, hardly responding to our attempts to start a conversation, and he became more irritable each time we tried to talk to him. "I think I see it," George announced over the live stream suddenly. I didn't see anything. Neither did any of the other viewers who were still tuned in. His avatar had stopped, and was staring off toward the slope of a hill upon which a single lonely skyscraper rose into the sky. His next comment came after another minute of silence. "I keep walking toward this thing, but it doesn't seem like I'm getting any closer. It has turned around, I think." His avatar wasn't moving at all. He hadn't moved since he claimed to have seen the Stalker. There was another pause. "You see it, don't statue." We all agreed that we could see nothing. "I see its face." "Bloody hell, there's something wrong with it." "It's Seps?" The live stream continued for a while, with George's avatar staring off into the depths of the gray gloom. We didn't hear another word from him. After a full day of no contact from George, I went over to his place to check on him in person. George laughed his behavior off, telling me he'd felt a little sick and decided to take a break. He refused to acknowledge how strangely he'd been acting during the live stream. He couldn't remember seeing the Stalker at all, and he couldn't remember how the live stream ended. Following this incident, George began to deteriorate more rapidly. His insomnia got worse. You could see signs of it whenever he bothered attending class. He started nodding off frequently. He was always staring off into space with a dull look in his eyes, hardly acknowledging the world going on around him. George had started a blog a year prior, as a game dev diary to keep the small community of fans the game had attracted up to date on its progress. By that time, it had become the main way he communicated with the outside world. "I'm sorry for all the delays in releasing the alpha. Development has been complicated by bugs and some other personal issues going on in my life. A lot of you have been asking, who is the Stalker? I've been thinking about this a lot recently, deliberating over whether it's better to leave it a mystery for the player to imagine, or if I should give a backstory to uncover as they explore. I would appreciate your input on this. I'm hoping to release an update to the demo to show off some of the new stuff I've patched in. I'm looking for playtesters. Tell me you hate the game if you want niche. I just want to hear some honest input from people. I had a dream last night. In the dream, I was wandering around in circles inside a city. It soon dawned on me that I was stuck inside the game. The Stalker was there. It took off its face, as if it were some kind of mask. What I saw after that frightened me enough to run like hell away from it. I wish I could tell you what it was I saw, but all I can recall is a haze. I kept running until I couldn't anymore. When I stopped and checked behind me, the stalker was gone. Then somehow I was back where I began my journey. I started to walk again for whatever reason. As is the case many times in dreams, I was unable to control my own actions. Later I found myself at the tall building where I first saw the stalker, and the events of the dream repeated themselves. I was confronted with the entity again. It took off its face, and I saw what lay beneath, and I ran in terror. This cycle repeated over and over. Each time the entity revealed itself as something horrifying, though once again I can't remember its appearance. I couldn't tell you if it had a different face each time or the same one. The dream lasted an uncomfortably long time. It was longer than any other dream I've ever had. When I woke up from it, I felt as exhausted as if I had spent the whole night awake. I have these dreams every night. They last so long and they seem too real. When I wake up from them, I feel as if I haven't slept at all. I find it increasingly difficult to focus during the day, and I'd become accustomed to feeling maddeningly tired all the time. I didn't know it was possible to want to sleep so badly and yet find it so bloody hard to get any proper rest. The sleeping pills aren't working anymore. I take them anyway. I'm very dependent on them, and I don't have the energy to deal with the side effects of quitting. At least they make me feel a little less crappy for a while. Weeks passed before another update was made. I think there were a pair of deleted posts written during the period, but I couldn't recover them. Here's the last thing he ever posted. Hi everyone. I need to focus on my mental health for a while. I will be pausing work on game development for now. I'm sorry for all of you who expected a release soon. I can't say when an alpha is going to arrive, or if I'm ever going to pick up this game again, to be honest. For anyone still tuned in, this is goodbye. For now. We'd had a talk with him, and finally gotten George to understand how seriously he needed help. He'd been persuaded to speak to a new doctor about his sleep issues, and he came back with a new prescription. He also acknowledged how obsessed he had become with the game and agreed to take a break from working on it. He was still in a bad state, but he'd taken the first steps in getting his life back together. I made a mistake then. Though I didn't realize it at the time, I allowed George to keep the possessed copy of the game. As long as the wraith remained in his life, its grip on his mind would never loosen. Not understanding that truth cost George everything. A couple of days after our last exchange, George was found dead in his apartment. It was a seizure, the doctors said. The seizure caused apnea, which was what caused his sudden death. The scene must have been traumatizing for his mother, who discovered him in his apartment. When she'd found him, he was lying on the floor. The room was dark, except for the flickering light of his computer. It was locked on the game world. George was spread-eagled, his face turned to the side, and one of his arms was dislocated. It felt like so little time ago that I was hanging out at George's place with a pile of pizzas and some drinks, and we were laughing at some silly game he'd created over the weekend for a game jam. The George I remembered was a totally different person from the haggard and mottled skeleton of a person we saw at the funeral. The game was abandoned. After a couple months passed, we began working on a new project together, but without George there to guide and motivate us, it lacked the passion and drive it needed to get anywhere. Soon enough, we abandoned it too. As for the wraith, it sat untouched within an unidentified file on George's computer for a while. His home remained undisturbed for close to a year. George's mother eventually decided to clean up the apartment. She asked us if there was anything of his we wanted to keep. After some deliberation, I agreed to be the one to go back there, to retrieve his computer containing the possessed copy of the game. My friends and I replayed the game to make sure the wraith hadn't moved again. Once we agreed that it was still inhabiting the game, we deliberated on what to do with it. We decided we couldn't dispose of the computer. The wraith would transfer itself to another conduit, and with the new item it would prey on someone else. Perhaps another one of us. After some debate, we agreed to have it sealed away instead. We hoped it might remain inactive, if it was isolated from people as it had been before I moved into the house. Nick rented out a storage unit. We locked the hard drive of the computer in a safe box, and we left it there. We hoped to never have to lay eyes on it again. For a couple of years, our plan actually worked. Nothing could replace the piece of our lives the wraith had stolen, but at least now we knew it wouldn't hurt anyone else. Things were complicated when the storage space was robbed. Nothing was stolen from the unit we'd rented, but the one next door was completely trashed. Nick elected to move the safe box and its contents to a new, more secure location, just in case, he said. Somewhere along the journey moving it, I believe the Wraith abandoned the hard drive and attached itself to something in Nick's car. From there it followed him home and silently slipped into his life. We didn't figure out this had happened until much later. Since graduating college, Nick had become a successful voice actor. He found roles in some video games and a couple of minor TV shows. Nick was also an aspiring ventriloquist, something he picked up from his father. His father had been a semi-popular ventriloquist during his time, and Nick liked to talk about continuing his legacy. It should be noted, Nick had never been great at ventriloquism. He was convinced he was good at it, but he really wasn't. He loved doing acts on stage, but very few could sit through the performances and feel entertained the way he entertained himself. He had a very off-brand kind of humor that only he seemed to understand, and he didn't take criticism of his acts very well. The fact was Nick was a great voice actor, and he had the technique down perfectly for making the dummy appear as if it were talking, but he just couldn't put together an interesting script, and that ruined his performances. Everything changed when the Wraith returned in its newest form a couple months later. Nick introduced his audiences to Tommy, the ventriloquist dummy he claimed to have discovered stashed away inside the depths of his basement. Nick played the role of a submissive character to the dummy, who subjected him to sharing with the audience embarrassing and controversial stories of their years spent together. It was a new kind of act, and quite different from the material he relied on previously, and it worked out great. The new content was engaging and funny, and it stood him out from his competitors. In a couple of weeks, he had gone from being a local bar performer to a local sensation. I knew the first time I saw him perform with Tommy in person that something was wrong with the dummy. I wasn't the only one who felt that way either. My friends shared my suspicions. My fear was all but confirmed after we visited Nick in person. After one show, when I looked into the dummy's dead, white eyes, I sensed something staring back at me. I felt the same way I did when I played our unfinished game, and the way I felt being around the possessed portraits. Nick patiently explained that we were silly to be worried about him. The dummy wasn't possessed or haunted, he said with a chuckle. He'd convinced himself everything that happened with George was a result of a mental health crisis, and the Wraith never really existed in the first place. The more we pushed him, the more irritable he became. He laughed at us. He called us crazy and claimed we were jealous of his success. He told us we were all pathetic, and then threatened to stop speaking to us if we didn't drop the issue. We were still arguing with one another about how to get him to see sense when an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A few weeks later, Nick asked me to review a new act he was working on. I was the only one on good terms with him at the time, but I managed to convince Nick to allow his friends to come over so they could apologize to him in person for the previous fight. The three of us had agreed to try something more radical. When we came over to visit, Matthew and Hayden, once they'd both convinced Nick of their remorse, we asked to see his newest act, and he settled in to show it to us. The moment he got the dummy out, we sprung into action. His reaction was comical. He refused to give up on his acts, as we tried to snatch Tommy out of his hands. The dummy begged him for help, as we tried to wrestle it away from him. It started laughing as he chased us through the house, its jaw swinging up and down as Nick ran after us. Nick was making the hysterical laughing sound, and yet simultaneously wore a completely horrified expression on his face. Once we'd made our escape, we smashed it into pieces with a hammer and threw the remains into the trash. The very next day, Nick was back on stage with the same dummy, which didn't have a scratch on it, acting like nothing had happened. He refused to speak to any of us again after that. We returned to researching the origins of the entity, hoping to find a way to get rid of the source of our problems. I won't get into this much because it was a futile exercise. When we asked for help online, the responses we got ranged from disbelieving to making fun of us. We talked to 2 people who claimed they could help us, but they both turned out to be trolls. That was about the extent of it. The Wraith was manipulating Nick. I suspected it gave him a taste of fame and success like he'd never experienced before, and got him drunk on it. He quickly became dependent on the dummy, since he couldn't perform without it. Over time, Nick's performances became increasingly disturbing and provocative. I continued to see them sporadically after our fallout, still convinced I could somehow get through to him. They were difficult to sit through. He knew certain things about the audience, who he frequently interacted with. The interactions he shared with people left many uncomfortable or offended. Others were entertained by his uncanny abilities and provocative personality. I saw people who were in hysterics after watching his performances and talked to others who were religious, fanatic fans of his. As its grip over his mind tightened, Nick began to talk to the dummy outside of shows. This was first spotted by his family, but it became obvious to everyone else around him in time. He had begun taking it with him wherever he went. Near the end, his brother claimed he never saw Nick without Tommy latched onto him. It had become his permanent companion. A part of him. This behavior didn't do wonders for his reputation, but by then he had accumulated a loyal band of followers who didn't care how eccentric and messed up he acted. The Wraith gave him the success he dreamed of since he was a child, but it did so at an unspeakable price. As for what happened to Nick, we never figured out a way to help him. The last place he was ever seen was somewhere strange called the Grand Circus of Mysteries. He worked there for a while as one of the star performers before inexplicably disappearing off the face of the earth, following a particularly disturbed act. The dummy left with him, but I had no doubt the thing living inside it was still lurking out there somewhere. I lost track of the entity for a while after it had finished with Nick. I assumed it had gone on to haunt somebody else's life. Personally, I wanted nothing more to do with it. My remaining moved out of town, and I soon lost contact with them. I think we all felt responsible for failing Nick, and we saw each other as reminders of this failure. It was better for all of us if we put the past behind us and moved on with our separate lives. I was watching the news one day, some years later. The anchor began discussing a sinkhole which had appeared in a stretch of desolate plains outside of my hometown. They described it as a black hole in the ground, which sucked in all the light from around it. I visited the place in person a couple days later. By then, half the people in town had gone over to take a look. I approached close enough to lean over and look down into the depths of the cave. When I gazed into the abyss, I felt something deep within staring back up at me. There I fell into a kind of daze. I felt as if I were falling into the blackness. The world around me became unreal and distant. My wife, who'd gone out there with me, claimed I stood over the hole for over a minute, swaying slightly as I stared down into it. It was her who broke me out of my trance. She had to slap me several times before I returned to my senses. By then I was leaning over far enough that she swore I was about to fall in. I've been keeping track of the sinkhole since I visited it. I heard a group of kids dared someone to venture inside shortly after I went there. Jeff, I believe his name was. He reappeared a couple of days later, with no recollection of having gone missing. I saw an older version of this boy in the news the other day. Nearly 10 years later, after I heard about what he did, I figured it was time for me to finally get this story out there. I'm guessing the Wraith has moved on from him by now. Perhaps it returned to the sinkhole, or maybe it has attached itself to a new conduit. Wherever it is, I don't doubt it is searching for another victim. Stay safe out there.